Hello everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Frozen Cargo. I've been a long-haul trucker for almost 15 years now, and let me tell you, I've seen some weird stuff out there on the endless highways that stretch across this vast country. You spend enough nights out on the road, especially in the middle of nowhere, and you start to notice things that just don't sit right with the natural order of things. The isolation gets to you sometimes, making you question what's real and what's just your tired mind playing trick. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that cold October night on Highway 93, somewhere deep in the Arizona desert, where civilization feels like a distant memory. I was doing an overnight run, hauling a refrigerated trailer from Phoenix to Las Vegas along my usual route. It was a journey I'd made more times than I could count, following the same ribbon of asphalt that cuts through some of the most desolate landscape in the Southwest. The load was medical supplies, nothing unusual, just another routine delivery that would help me make my monthly payments and keep food on the table. It was the dead of night, maybe around 1 in the morning, when the world belongs to night shift workers, insomniacs, and those of us who make our living in the darkness between dusk and dawn. The highway was empty, just me, the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky, and the endless black stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. I'd done this drive so many times that I knew every turn, every bend, and every truck stop along the way. I could navigate it with my eyes closed. But this particular night felt different from the very start. The air was thick and heavy, like something invisible was hanging just out of sight, waiting and watching. There was an electricity in the atmosphere that made the hair on my arms stand on end, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently than usual. I had just passed Kingman, a small desert town that barely registers as a blip on most maps, and was about 50 miles from Hoover Dam when my CB radio suddenly crackled to life. The sound startled me because I hadn't heard anything but static for the past couple of hours. The highways had been unusually quiet even for a weeknight, and the sudden burst of activity through the speakers made my heart skip a beat. At first I thought it might be another trucker on the same route, maybe someone looking for company during the long, lonely hours before sunrise. But when I grabbed the receiver and listened carefully, all I could hear was heavy breathing. Not the usual static or garbled voices that sometimes come through on the CB frequencies, just slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to fill the cab of my truck. The sound was unsettling, almost intimate in its proximity, as if someone was sitting right beside me in the passenger seat. "Breaker 19, you good out there?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller and more uncertain than I intended. The breathing stopped abruptly, creating a silence that felt even more ominous than the strange sounds that had preceded it. Then, through the crackle of the old radio, I heard it. A faint voice, almost a whisper, saying words that would haunt me for years to come. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." Chills shot down my spine like ice water, and I looked at my dashboard clock, which read 1:13 a.m. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was probably just some drunk playing games with the radio frequencies. I'd encountered similar pranks before, especially on this stretch of road where desert towns have their fair share of characters with too much time on their hands and too little sense. I turned off the CB radio and focused on the drive ahead, but the stranger's warning echoed in my mind like a broken record. The night seemed darker than usual, with the moon barely giving off any light, hidden behind thin clouds that drifted across the sky like ghostly fingers. The desert around me appeared unnaturally quiet, without even the wind stirring the sparse vegetation that dotted the landscape. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. After driving for what felt like an eternity, I noticed something strange in my side mirror, a faint pair of headlights far behind me. That wasn't particularly odd on its own, but these lights were closing in fast, much faster than any normal vehicle should have been traveling on this stretch of highway. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but found myself glancing back every few seconds, watching as the lights grew larger and brighter with each passing moment. The pursuing vehicle was gaining on me at an alarming rate, and soon it was right on my tail, so close that I could see it clearly in my mirrors. It was an old beat-up truck that looked like something from the 1960s, rusted and weathered by decades of desert sun and wind. The vehicle had only a single flickering headlight, which gave it an almost supernatural appearance as it moved faster than its decrepit condition should have allowed. "Idiot," I muttered under my breath, assuming it was just another reckless driver who didn't understand the basic rules of highway courtesy. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping the universal signal would encourage the driver to back off and maintain a safe following distance. Instead of complying, the truck swerved to the side and pulled up next to me, matching my speed with an engine that roared like some ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. I glanced over at the other vehicle, expecting to see an aggressive driver, or perhaps someone in distress who needed assistance. What I saw instead defied all logic and reason. There was no one in the driver's seat. The cab was completely empty, yet the steering wheel was moving on its own, making subtle adjustments to keep the truck perfectly aligned with mine. The vehicle was keeping pace with my rig, as if controlled by an invisible hand, its engine roaring with supernatural power. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear coursing through my veins. This wasn't a prank or some elaborate joke. This was something else entirely, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. The phantom truck stayed beside me for what felt like an eternity, though it could have only been seconds, before it suddenly veered off the road, plowing into the desert sand and vanishing into the night without leaving any trace of its passage. I didn't slow down. If anything, I sped up, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my hands began to cramp. I didn't care what I had just witnessed or how impossible it seemed. I was determined to reach Vegas without stopping for anything. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum, and every shadow on the road ahead seemed to move and shift in ways that defied explanation. About 10 miles later, the air around me began to change in ways that made no meteorological sense. It grew colder, unnaturally cold for the desert at night, where temperatures typically remain mild even after sunset. My dashboard thermometer, which had been reading a normal 72 degrees, suddenly dropped to 30, then 20, then 10 degrees, all within the span of just a few minutes. Frost began forming on the inside of my windows, creating intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate in their design. I glanced at my refrigerated trailer through the side mirror and saw thick fog or mist swirling around the back of the truck, creeping around the edges like icy fingers exploring every surface. The temperature gauge continued its impossible descent, and when it finally hit 0 degrees, something even more extraordinary happened. The truck stopped moving, not because I had applied the brakes or encountered any mechanical failure, but as if some invisible force had simply decided that my journey should end at this exact spot on the highway. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor and tried desperately to turn the steering wheel, but nothing responded to my commands. It was as if something massive and immovable had latched onto the trailer and was holding it firmly in place, defying the laws of physics and mechanics. The fog around the back of the truck continued to thicken, and I could see it in my mirrors, coiling and twisting like something alive was moving within its depths. With my heart racing and adrenaline pumping through my system, I grabbed my emergency flashlight from the dashboard and stepped out into the frigid night air. My breath immediately formed thick clouds of vapor, and the asphalt beneath my feet was covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched with each step. As I made my way around to the back of the trailer, each footfall echoing in the supernatural silence, I prepared myself for whatever impossible sight awaited me. Standing in the swirling fog was a figure unlike anything I had ever encountered in my years on the road. It was impossibly tall, draped in what appeared to be tattered clothing from another era, like something that had stepped out of a historical photograph. The figure's face was hidden beneath a deep hood, but I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Without speaking, it slowly raised one arm and pointed directly at my trailer, as if trying to communicate something of vital importance. My hands trembling from both cold and fear, I approached the trailer door and fumbled with the latch. The metal was so cold it burned my skin, but I managed to release the mechanism. As soon as the door opened, thick fog spilled out like water from a broken dam, pouring onto the road and surrounding my feet in an icy embrace that seemed to have weight and substance. Holding my breath and clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, I stepped inside the trailer. The cold hit me like a physical wall, and my flashlight beam flickered uncertainly before revealing the horrifying truth of what I had been unknowingly transporting across the desert. Stacked throughout the trailer were human bodies, frozen solid and wrapped in plastic like merchandise in some hellish warehouse. Their faces were visible through the clear wrapping, eyes wide open in expressions of terror, mouths frozen in silent screams that spoke of unimaginable fear and suffering. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet in my haste to escape the nightmare I had discovered. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, trying to find some rational explanation for the impossible cargo I had been carrying. How had these bodies gotten into my trailer? When had they been loaded? And most importantly, who was responsible for this macabre shipment? Without wasting another second, I rushed back to my cab, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. To my amazement, the truck responded immediately, roaring back to life as if nothing unusual had happened. The frost on my windows began to melt. The thermometer slowly climbed back to normal readings, and I was able to drive away from that cursed spot as if I had been released from some supernatural spell. But as I sped through the night toward the distant lights of Las Vegas, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone in the cab. The mysterious figure had allowed me to leave, but I sensed that our encounter was far from over. Something had marked me that night, something that would follow me for the rest of my days. When I finally reached the depot in Vegas hours later, I parked the truck, left the keys in the ignition, and walked away without looking back. I never filed a report about the bodies, never spoke to my dispatcher about what had happened, and never hauled another load. Some experiences change you so fundamentally that returning to your old life becomes impossible. And that night on Highway 93 was mine. Even now, years later, when the desert wind howls outside my window in the small apartment where I've tried to build a new life, I can still hear that whispered warning echoing through the static of memory. Don't stop. Sometimes I wonder if I should have listened more carefully, if there was something more I was supposed to understand about that supernatural encounter in the Arizona desert, where the line between the living and the dead becomes as blurred as the horizon at dawn. Story 2. The Highway That Doesn't Exist. I've been a truck driver for over 2 decades now, and after all these years traversing the highways and back roads of this vast country, I've learned one fundamental truth about the road. It never forgets. People think it's just asphalt and painted lines, something you drive over and leave behind without a second thought. But I'm here to tell you that some roads, especially the ones that cut through the middle of nowhere, have a memory all their own. They remember every traveler who has passed over them, every tragedy that has unfolded on their surface, and they don't always allow you to pass through unchanged. This particular story happened about 6 years ago during one of those bitter winter nights when the air felt like needles on exposed skin, and the wind carried whispers of something darker than mere cold. I had a haul that evening, a routine run from Dallas to Kansas City that should have been straightforward and uneventful. The load was heavy machinery parts, Nothing particularly valuable or dangerous, just industrial equipment that needed to reach its destination before the weekend. It wasn't a short trip by any means, but I'd made far worse journeys in my career, and the pay was decent enough to make the long hours worthwhile. I had been driving for several hours without incident, listening to the steady drone of my engine and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt, when the world around me began to feel different in ways I couldn't immediately explain. The CB chatter had died down to nothing, which wasn't unusual for late-night drives, and my radio had drifted out of range of any clear stations, leaving me with nothing but static and the occasional fragment of distant voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify. Around midnight, I came upon a part of the route that I didn't recognize, despite having driven this way countless times over the years. There was something unfamiliar about this particular stretch of highway, an absence of the landmarks and mile markers I had come to expect. At first, I attributed this confusion to the darkness and my own fatigue, thinking perhaps my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. The highway had been rerouted and improved several times in recent years, so it was possible I was simply traveling through a section that had been recently completed. But the farther I drove, the more unsettling the experience became. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, with no signs, no exits, and no other traffic in either direction. It was as if I had somehow slipped off the main highway and onto some forgotten piece of asphalt that existed outside the normal flow of commerce and travel. The snow began falling more heavily, covering the road in a slick layer of ice that forced me to reduce my speed and strain my eyes to see beyond the reach of my headlights. Then I saw it, a mile marker standing tall beside the road, its reflective surface catching my headlights like a beacon in the darkness. As I drew closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold with inexplicable dread. The marker was rusted and weather-beaten, looking as though it had been abandoned for decades. But more disturbing than its appearance was the number displayed on its face. Mile 0. This made absolutely no sense, as I was nowhere near the beginning of any highway, and I had passed numerous mile markers during my journey, all indicating much higher numbers. I slowed my truck to a crawl, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, while my GPS system flickered and displayed nothing but a blank screen where the detailed map should have been. The electronic navigation that I had come to rely on seemed as confused as I was, unable to determine my location or provide any guidance for continuing my journey. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cab's weather stripping. The snow was falling harder now, coming down in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet in any direction. The road stretched into a void of swirling white, and I had no idea where I was or how to get back to familiar territory. Despite my growing unease, I felt compelled to continue driving forward, as if stopping on this mysterious stretch of highway would invite some unimaginable consequence. That's when I first heard the sound, a low hum that was barely audible above the noise of my engine, like static from an old television set or the distant buzz of electrical equipment. At first, I thought it might be interference from my radio, but the sound wasn't coming from the speakers. It was emanating from somewhere outside the truck, surrounding me in the winter night like an invisible presence. I checked my mirrors repeatedly, but there was nothing behind me except the road covered in snow and the impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow my taillights. Still, the humming sound grew louder and more distinct, evolving from simple static into something that resembled human voices speaking in whispers, too faint to understand. The words were just beyond the edge of comprehension, like conversations heard through thick walls or across great distances. The hair on my arm stood up beneath my heavy jacket, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting the urge to press harder on the accelerator. I wanted desperately to escape this strange place, but the snow was too thick and the road too treacherous to risk losing control of my heavy rig. I had to be patient, had to trust that eventually this nightmare would end and I would find myself back on familiar ground. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something darting across the road ahead of me. Too quick and too large to be any normal wildlife. My heart skipped a beat and I applied the brakes gently, bringing the truck to a crawling pace while I scanned the swirling snow for any sign of what had crossed my path. Whatever it was, it moved with an unnatural fluidity that defied the laws of physics I thought I understood. Another mile marker appeared through the snow, its outline barely visible in the storm. As I drew near enough to read it, my breath caught in my throat. Mile 0 again. I had just passed an identical marker, yet here was another one bearing the same impossible number. I glanced down at my dashboard clock, watching the digital display tick away the minutes as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. I was trapped, somehow, driving in an endless loop on a highway that shouldn't exist, with no turns, no exits, and no escape routes visible in any direction. I tried radioing out on my CB, hoping desperately that some other driver might hear me and provide guidance or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Red on Interstate 35 North. Does anyone copy?" My voice sounded hollow and small in the cab, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. I waited, hearing nothing but the humming static and the whispered voices that seemed to be growing more insistent with each passing mile. After what felt like an eternity, something faint crackled through the radio speakers, a voice so distorted and broken that I could barely make out the words. "Not here," it seemed to say, though the static made it impossible to be certain. I leaned forward, pressing the microphone close to my lips and trying again. "Say again, who's out there? What do you mean, not here?" The voice returned, clearer this time, but filled with a hollow emptiness that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt a chill shoot through me that had nothing to do with the winter weather. I couldn't tell if the voice belonged to a man or woman, only that it sounded distant and otherworldly, as if it was reaching me from across an impossible gulf of space and time. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to remain calm. "Where am I?" But the CB radio crackled once more and then went completely dead, leaving me alone with the humming voices and the endless snow that continued to fall like a curtain between me and the rest of the world. Another mile 0 marker appeared, and then another, each one identical to the last, each one a reminder that I was trapped in some kind of supernatural loop that defied all logic and reason. Panic began to bubble up in my chest like acid, threatening to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. I needed to stop, needed to get my bearings and figure out what was happening to me, but something deep in my gut screamed warnings against leaving the safety of my moving truck. I slowed the vehicle and eased it toward the shoulder, the snow crunching beneath the massive tires as I brought it to a complete stop. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, and my breath came in shallow, rapid bursts that fogged the windows and made it even harder to see into the darkness beyond. The whispering voices outside grew louder, not just one or two now, but many overlapping conversations that blended together into an incomprehensible murmur of sound. Something knocked softly on my driver's side window, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was a gentle tap, almost polite in its restraint, but in the absolute silence of that cursed highway, it sounded as loud as gunfire. I forced myself to remain calm, keeping my eyes focused straight ahead on the snow-covered windshield, refusing to acknowledge whatever presence had approached my truck. Another knock came, more insistent this time, followed by several more in rapid succession. Against every instinct that screamed at me to ignore it, I slowly turned my head toward the driver's side window. Pressed against the glass was a face so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness, with hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that moved constantly, whispering words I couldn't hear through the protective barrier of the window. I screamed involuntarily and slammed the truck into gear, flooring the accelerator without regard for the icy conditions. The tires spun frantically on the slick surface before finally finding purchase, and the truck lurched forward into the storm. Behind me, I could hear the voices growing fainter as I put distance between myself and whatever supernatural presence had been trying to communicate with me. I drove for what felt like hours, though time seemed to have lost all meaning in that place outside normal reality. The snow gradually began to ease, and eventually I found myself back on a road I recognized, with familiar mile markers and working GPS navigation. My radio crackled back to life, picking up distant stations that played normal music and ran ordinary advertisements for everyday products and services. I never did figure out what happened that night, or how I ended up on that impossible stretch of highway. I tried researching it later, looking for any mention of a road marked with mile 0 in that area, but found nothing. It was as if the highway existed only for me, only for that one terrifying night when I learned that some roads lead to places that aren't supposed to exist, places where the normal rules of geography and physics don't apply. Every now and then, when I'm driving late at night through unfamiliar territory, I think about those voices and that pale face pressed against my window. I remember the warning that came through my radio, "You're not supposed to be here." And I wonder if one day I'll find myself on that road again, or if it will find me, ready to finish whatever business we left unresolved in the swirling snow of that impossible winter night. Story 3. The Woman on Devil's Highway. I've been a long-haul trucker for 20 years now, and in that time I've heard all the stories that get passed around truck stops and diners across the country. Tales of haunted highways, phantom hitchhikers, and vehicles that vanish into thin air are as much a part of trucking culture as CB radios and logbooks. But I never gave much credence to ghost stories, always figuring they were just the product of too much time on the road, too much caffeine, and not enough sleep. At least, that's what I thought until last year, when I found myself on a stretch of highway that made me question everything I believed about the world and what lies beyond the veil of ordinary experience. It was late November, and I was hauling a load of lumber from the forests of Oregon down to a construction site in New Mexico. It was one of those runs that stretches across multiple nights, covering vast distances through some of the most remote and desolate parts of the American Southwest. This was the second night of the trip, and I was making good time despite the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather that had been following me since crossing into New Mexico. Found myself on a lonely stretch of Highway 491, known locally among truckers and locals alike as the Devil's Highway. The name alone should have been warning enough, but I had traveled many roads with ominous nicknames over the years, and most of them turned out to be perfectly ordinary stretches of asphalt, with colorful histories and active imaginations behind their reputations. The highway cut through the heart of the desert, where civilization felt like a distant memory, and the vast emptiness could swallow a person's sense of scale and perspective. There were no other vehicles in sight in either direction, just the wide-open blackness of the desert stretching away on both sides of the road, broken only by the occasional silhouette of a mesa or rock formation against the star-filled sky. The hum of my engine was the only sound for miles, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made the solitude feel both peaceful and unsettling. The clock on my dashboard read 2:37 a.m., which I had learned over the years was a particularly strange time to be driving, neither late nor early, but existing in some liminal space that seemed to belong to neither night nor day. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, not even the distant glow of headlights on the horizon or the brief flash of taillights disappearing around a curve ahead. It was as if I was the only person left in the world, driving through a landscape that existed outside of normal time and space. Usually there's some sign of life out there. Animals crossing the road, insects drawn to the headlights, or the occasional fellow trucker making the same lonely journey. But that night, it felt as if the entire world had fallen into a deep sleep, leaving only me awake to witness whatever was about to unfold. That's when I first saw her. At first, it was just a blur on the side of the road, barely visible in the reach of my headlights, something that might have been a piece of debris or a road sign damaged by weather and time. I squinted and leaned forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when the shape resolved itself into the unmistakable silhouette of a person standing alone in the middle of nowhere. As I drew closer, I could make out more details that only deepened the mystery. It was a woman, standing motionless by the shoulder of the highway, facing away from the road toward the vast expanse of desert that stretched endlessly into the darkness. She was wearing a dress, not the kind of practical clothing you'd expect to see on someone stranded in such a remote location, but a long, old-fashioned dress that looked like something from another era entirely. The fabric fluttered slightly in the desert breeze, but otherwise she was completely still, showing no sign that she had noticed my approaching headlights or the rumble of my diesel engine. My first instinct was to slow down and offer assistance. After all, the last thing any driver wants is to leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere, especially at this hour of the night and in such an isolated location. The desert can be unforgiving to those caught unprepared, and hypothermia is a real danger, even in areas where daytime temperatures soar. But as I rolled past, something about the scene made me hesitate, some primitive instinct that warned me against stopping. Perhaps it was the way she stood, so perfectly still and indifferent to my presence, as if she didn't care whether I saw her or not. Or maybe it was the incongruity of her old-fashioned dress in the middle of the modern desert, suggesting either someone with unusual fashion choices or something far more mysterious. Whatever the reason, instead of pulling over, I continued driving, though the image of the solitary figure remained burned in my memory. For several miles, I told myself I had made the right decision. After all, who wears a dress like that in the middle of the desert at 3 a.m? It didn't make any logical sense, and there are plenty of dangerous people in the world who might use unusual circumstances to lure unsuspecting drivers into vulnerable situations. But the further I drove, the more that sense of unease grew into genuine guilt. What if she really needed help? What if she was in trouble and I was the only person who could provide assistance? About 5 miles down the road, my conscience finally got the better of my caution, and I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Against my better judgment, I decided to turn around and check on her. I could at least offer her a ride to the nearest town, or help her contact someone who could pick her up. The highway was so empty that making a U-turn wasn't difficult. I swung the rig around, the headlights cutting through the desert night as I headed back toward the spot where I had seen her. I drove for what felt longer than it should have, given that the road was straight and I had a clear memory of where the encounter had occurred. But as I approached the area where she had been standing, something felt wrong. I slowed the truck to a crawl, scanning both sides of the road, the shoulder, and even the desert beyond for any sign of the mysterious woman. But she was nowhere to be found. I brought the truck to a complete stop and sat there idling, staring out at the empty landscape and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had she been picked up by another vehicle in the brief time I had been gone? It seemed unlikely, given that I hadn't seen any other traffic for hours, but it was the only rational explanation I could come up with. Or perhaps she had simply wandered off into the desert, though that possibility filled me with even more concern for her safety. Maybe she got picked up, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow and unconvincing even as I spoke them. More likely, and far more troubling, was the possibility that my tired eyes had been playing tricks on me, that the isolation and monotony of the night drive had caused me to see something that wasn't really there. But the image had been so clear, so detailed, that I found it hard to believe it was merely a hallucination brought on by fatigue. A cold feeling washed over me as I sat there in the darkness, and despite the rational explanations I was trying to construct, I felt a deep sense of relief that I hadn't stopped the first time. Whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, something about it had felt fundamentally wrong from the beginning. I turned the truck around again and resumed my original route, trying to push the incident out of my mind and focus on the long miles still ahead of me. Another hour passed as I drove through the endless desert landscape, and I tried to convince myself that the encounter had been nothing more than a tired trucker's overactive imagination, combined with the hypnotic effects of staring down an empty highway for too long. But as the road stretched on before me, that feeling of dread continued to linger in my chest like an unwelcome passenger, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently than usual. At 3:45 a.m., my CB radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking the silence that had surrounded me for hours. "Breaker 19, you copy?" came a voice, deep and gravelly, belonging to someone I didn't recognize. The unexpected communication made me jump slightly, but I was grateful for the human contact after hours of solitude. I picked up the microphone and responded, "Yeah, I copy. What's your 20?" I tried to sound casual and professional, the way truckers are supposed to communicate with each other on the open road. "Just passing mile marker 173, the voice replied. "You out here all alone tonight?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something about the way it was phrased made my stomach tighten with unease. Mile marker 173 was approximately where I had seen the woman standing by the roadside, and according to my dashboard, I had just passed mile marker 175, which meant whoever was speaking was very close to my location. 10-4, I replied cautiously, scanning my mirrors for any sign of another vehicle. "You see anything strange out here?" It was a fishing expedition, an attempt to gauge whether I was the only one experiencing unusual phenomena on this desolate stretch of highway. There was a long pause, long enough that I began to wonder if the other driver had lost his signal or decided not to respond. Then the voice came back, quieter this time, with an undertone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You saw her, didn't you?" My heart nearly stopped beating, and for a moment I couldn't find my voice to respond. How could this stranger possibly know about my encounter with the mysterious woman? Had he seen her too, or was there something even more sinister going on? "Saw who?" I asked, trying to play dumb while my mind raced through the possible explanations for what was happening. The voice on the other end chuckled, a low, humorless sound that contained no warmth or genuine amusement. "The woman standing on the side of the road, she's been out here for a long time, you know. A very long time." The words sent a chill crawling up my spine like ice water in my veins. "Just don't let her in. Whatever you do, don't stop for her." The radio clicked off, leaving only static and the sound of my own labored breathing. I stared at the CB unit for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. I'd never believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but this felt like something far beyond the realm of normal experience, something that challenged the fundamental assumptions I had about the world and how it operated. I tried to shake off the conversation, focusing on the road ahead and the familiar routine of long-distance driving, but my heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't get the stranger's warning out of my head. Every shadow on the side of the road now looked like it might be her. Every flicker of movement in the distance made my pulse race with anticipation and dread. Then, just as I was starting to calm down and convince myself that I was letting my imagination run wild, I saw her again. This time she was standing directly in the middle of the road, facing my approaching headlights with a pale face that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her eyes were wide and dark, reflecting the light like pools of black water, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was trying to speak words that would never come. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as I fought to control the massive rig. The truck came to a shuddering halt just feet from where she stood, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. I could see her more clearly now through the windshield, and every detail only confirmed that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. Her dress was tattered and dirty, her hair tangled and wild, as if she had been wandering the desert for years without care or shelter. She didn't look like a living person so much as something wearing the skin of a person, but not quite understanding how to inhabit it properly. There was an otherworldly quality to her presence that made my primitive survival instincts scream warnings that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand and pointed at the passenger door of my cab. The gesture was unmistakable. She wanted me to let her in, to give her a ride to wherever lost souls go when they finally find transportation. But everything about her presence filled me with a terror so profound that I immediately locked all the doors and kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel. For what felt like an eternity, we remained in this supernatural standoff. Me sitting in the safety of my cab, her standing motionless in the road with her finger still pointing at my door. I could feel her eyes boring into me through the windshield, and though her expression never changed, there was something in her gaze that spoke of decades or perhaps centuries of waiting for someone like me to come along. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, she lowered her hand and turned away, walking slowly off the road and into the desert darkness. I watched her until she disappeared completely, swallowed up by the night as if she had never existed at all. Only then did I put the truck back in gear and continued driving, pushing the accelerator harder than was probably safe in my desperation to escape that cursed stretch of highway. I didn't stop again until I reached the bright lights and blessed normalcy of Albuquerque, where I delivered my load and took a full week off to process what had happened. No matter how much time passed, I could never forget that night on Devil's Highway, and I made sure to take alternate routes on all my future runs through New Mexico. Some encounters leave marks on your soul that never fully heal, and that pale woman pointing at my door was definitely one of them. Story 4. The Crescent Ridge Rest Stop. I've been a trucker for most of my adult life, and if there's one thing I've learned about this job, it's that the road can do strange things to a person's mind. The endless miles, the isolation, the hypnotic rhythm of tires on asphalt, they all combine to create an environment where reality can become fluid and uncertain. I've heard every tall tale, ghost story, and piece of highway folklore that gets passed around the truck stops and diners where drivers gather to share their experiences. Most of these stories are exactly that, just stories, entertainment to pass the time during mandatory rest breaks. But every now and then something happens that sticks with you, a story that gets under your skin because you know with absolute certainty that it's not just another tale spun from loneliness and caffeine. I didn't believe that until last winter, when I discovered for myself that some places exist outside the normal flow of time and space. It was late December, just a few days before Christmas, and I was running my usual long-haul route from Denver to Salt Lake City. The cargo hold was filled with holiday merchandise that needed to reach various retail stores before the final shopping rush began in earnest. The roads were treacherous with ice and snow, and the weather reports were warning about a major storm system moving in from the west, but I had deadlines to meet and a delivery schedule that left little room for delays. Plus, I figured with my experience and the right amount of caution, I'd be able to outrun the worst of the weather before it really settled in for the duration. I was completely wrong about that assumption. About halfway through the drive, the storm really picked up with a vengeance that caught even the meteorologist off guard. The snow came down in sheets so thick that it was like driving through a white curtain, and the wind howled like something alive and angry, rocking my truck with gusts that threatened to push me off the road entirely. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, and every mile became a test of nerves and driving skill that pushed me to my limits. I knew I'd have to pull over soon before the conditions became completely impossible to navigate safely. I wasn't about to risk jackknifing on the ice, especially not with the valuable cargo I was carrying, and the knowledge that help would be hours away if I got into serious trouble. The CB chatter had gone completely silent as other drivers found shelter for the night, but I'd gotten a late start on this run and was trying desperately to make up time before admitting defeat. I remembered seeing a sign for a rest stop a few miles back, barely visible through the swirling snow, so I decided that would be my best option for waiting out the worst of the storm. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than getting stranded in the middle of the highway or sliding off into a ditch where I might not be found until spring. When I finally spotted the faded sign ahead, I could barely make out the weathered letters through the snow. Crescent Ridge Rest Stop, 1 mile. I'd never heard of the place before, which was unusual since I'd been driving this route for years and thought I knew every truck stop, rest area, and fuel station between Denver and Salt Lake City. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and any port in a storm would have to do. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, the place looked completely deserted, which wasn't particularly surprising given the severity of the weather, but something about the entire facility felt off in a way that I couldn't immediately identify. The parking lot was mostly covered in snow, with only a few tire tracks leading in and out, suggesting that very few people had used this facility recently. The building itself was an old, squat structure that looked like it had been constructed decades ago and then forgotten by time and maintenance crews. Flickering lights above the entrance cast long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground, and the whole place had a worn-down, abandoned feel to it, like a relic from an earlier era of highway travel. I parked my rig and turned off the engine, letting the sudden silence settle around me like a heavy blanket. Outside, the wind continued to howl and rattle the truck, and I could hear the faint creaking of old signs swinging in the gusts. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and checked my phone for any signal, but the screen showed nothing but no service, or this area was simply too remote for reliable coverage. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, figuring I'd wait for a few hours until the storm passed, or at least diminished enough to make driving feasible again. But sleep wouldn't come, and there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't right about this place. It wasn't just the storm or the isolation. I'd weathered plenty of both during my years on the road. This was something different, something that made the air feel thick and oppressive, as if the building itself was watching me through the swirling snow. After about an hour of restless fidgeting and failed attempts to doze, I decided to stretch my legs and check out the facilities. Maybe I could grab a cup of coffee or use the restroom while I waited for conditions to improve. The storm wasn't showing any signs of letting up, and I figured it would be a while before I could safely return to the highway. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the bitter cold. The snow crunched under my boots as I trudged through the parking lot toward the main building, and the wind cut through my heavy coat like it was made of paper. The cold was so intense that my breath came out in thick clouds of vapor that were immediately swept away by the howling gusts. The building loomed ahead of me, its windows dark and covered with a layer of frost that made it impossible to see inside. I pushed open the front door, and a bell above it jingled weakly as I stepped into the interior. The space was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed and hummed like angry insects. The place was much larger than I had expected from the outside, with a small convenience store on one side and a row of restrooms on the other. There were a few wooden benches scattered around the main area, and a vending machine near the entrance that looked like it hadn't been serviced in years. But the most unsettling thing about the place was that it was completely empty. Not just lacking customers, which would have been understandable given the weather, but there was no one working there either. No cashier behind the counter, no maintenance staff, no one at all. The entire facility was abandoned, yet the lights were on and the door had been unlocked as if it was still in operation. I walked over to the counter, expecting to find someone behind it, or at least a sign explaining the situation, but the area was completely deserted. A thick layer of dust covered the surface, and the magazines in the rack by the door looked like they hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. The whole scene felt like stepping into a place that time had forgotten, a rest stop caught in some kind of temporal loop where it continued to exist long after its purpose had ended. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space with a hollow sound that seemed to go on forever. No answer came back, just the steady buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant howl of wind outside. I glanced around nervously, feeling the hair on the back of my neck beginning to stand up. Something about this place was fundamentally wrong, and every instinct I had was telling me to get back to my truck and find somewhere else to wait out the storm. But I had already committed to staying here, and the weather outside was getting worse by the minute. I decided to head for the bathroom and then get back to the relative safety of my cab as quickly as possible. As I walked down the narrow hallway toward the restrooms, I thought I heard something, a faint whispering sound, like someone talking just under their breath. I stopped and listened carefully, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me to wonder if it had been real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. The men's room door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning like they hadn't been used in decades. The space inside was even colder than the main area, and my breath came out in visible puffs of steam. The mirror above the sink was cracked and dirty, and all the stall doors were closed, which struck me as odd since there was clearly no one else in the building. I used the facilities quickly, eager to get out of that unsettling space and back to the warmth of my truck. As I washed my hands at the sink, I caught a glimpse of something in the cracked mirror behind me, just a flash of movement. There and gone in an instant. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the bathroom was empty except for the closed stalls and the steady drip of water from a leaking faucet. I rushed out of there without looking back, my nerves on edge and my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Whatever was going on in this place, I wanted no part of it. I headed back toward the main entrance, planning to return to my truck and wait out the storm there regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. But as I stepped back into the main area, the flickering lights overhead cast strange, distorted shadows across the floor, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing by the vending machine, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like an old, weathered coat, and its face was completely obscured by shadows. I froze in place, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. The figure was motionless, watching me with an intensity I could feel even though I couldn't see its eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in absolute silence, neither of us moving or speaking. Then, slowly and deliberately, the figure raised one hand and pointed directly at the exit door. I didn't need any further encouragement. I bolted for the door, my boots slipping on the icy floor as I scrambled to escape whatever presence had been waiting for me in that cursed place. I burst through the entrance and ran across the parking lot to my truck, not stopping until I was safely inside with the doors locked and the engine running. But as I prepared to leave, I made the mistake of looking back at the rest stop one final time. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. The building was surrounded by dozens of figures, all tall and thin like the one I had encountered inside, standing motionless in the snow. They were watching my truck with an attention so focused and intense that I could feel it even through the metal and glass that separated us. I threw the truck into gear and drove back into the storm, not caring about the dangerous conditions or the risk of getting stuck. Anything was better than staying in that place for another minute. I drove for hours through the blizzard, white-knuckling the steering wheel until I finally reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City and the blessed sight of normal civilization. Later, when I tried to research Crescent Ridge Rest Stop, I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. According to every map, database, and local authority I contacted, no such place existed. There was no rest stop by that name anywhere along my route, and no record of one ever having been built. It was as if the entire facility existed outside the normal world, a way station for travelers who had somehow wandered off the beaten path of reality and into something far more sinister and unknown. Story 5. The Phantom Trucker. Been driving the highways of America for nearly 20 years, seeing every corner of this vast country from the sun-baked deserts of Arizona to the frozen passes of Montana. There's a certain peace that comes with long hauls through the night, When the world belongs to the few of us who make our living in the darkness between dusk and dawn, the hum of tires on pavement, the glow of distant headlights in the rearview mirror, the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon, these things become your companions on the lonely roads that connect our cities and towns. But there's also a certain loneliness that settles into your bones during those long hours, a kind of isolation that comes with the miles and the solitude. Sometimes the road gets into your head in ways you don't expect, and sometimes it brings things out of the darkness that you'd rather not encounter. This story still haunts me, and I don't tell it often, but tonight as I sit here in my rig waiting for another haul to begin, I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me from the shadows beyond my headlights. It was mid-July, hotter than the depths of hell, when I found myself heading down a stretch of Interstate 90 between Montana and Washington. The assignment was straightforward enough, a late-night haul of steel pipes from a construction site back to a supply depot, the kind of routine cargo that doesn't require much thinking, just a steady hand on the wheel and an eye on the gauges. The load was secured properly, the paperwork was in order, and I was making good time through the mountain passes that divided the two states. I'd been on the road for hours, cutting through the endless Montana landscape under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The sun had set long ago, leaving nothing but darkness and the distant silhouettes of mountains against the night sky. It was one of those peaceful drives where time seems to slow down, and the worries of the world fade away, replaced by the meditative rhythm of the highway and the comforting rumble of the diesel engine. The road was nearly empty, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of interstate during the late-night hours. Occasionally I'd see the headlights of another vehicle in the distance, but for the most part, it was just me, my rig, and the highway stretching out ahead like a black river flowing through the wilderness. The radio was picking up nothing but static from the few stations that reached this remote area, and the CB was equally quiet, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady drone of the road. It was somewhere around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the lights in my side mirror. At first, I assumed it was just another driver who had been making good time through the night. Maybe a fellow trucker trying to reach a delivery deadline, or someone driving through to avoid the heat of the day. But as the lights grew closer, I began to realize that something wasn't quite right about the vehicle that was approaching from behind. The headlights were flickering strangely, pulsing and dimming like they were struggling to stay illuminated. They didn't have the steady, consistent glow of modern automotive lighting, but rather the weak, uncertain flicker of old incandescent bulbs fighting against electrical problems or age. I watched them in my mirror, trying to get a better sense of what kind of vehicle was behind me, but the lights were too dim and too far away to make out any details. As the minutes passed, the mysterious vehicle continued to gain on me, but its approach was slow and methodical rather than aggressive. There was something almost predatory about the way it closed the distance, like a hunter stalking prey with infinite patience and determination. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched and evaluated by whoever was driving the vehicle behind me. I tried turning on the radio again, hoping for some music or conversation to distract me from the growing sense of unease, but all I could find was dead air and static. The CB radio was equally unresponsive, picking up nothing but the empty hiss of unused frequencies. It was as if the entire world had gone silent except for the sound of my engine and the mysterious presence that continued to follow me through the darkness. The lights grew closer still, and I could finally make out some details of the vehicle in my mirrors. It was definitely a truck, probably a semi like mine, but it looked old. Much older than anything you'd typically see on the interstate these days. The cab appeared to be from several decades past, with the boxy, angular design of trucks from the 1970s or early 1980s. Even more unsettling was the way it moved, with a kind of fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics governing such massive vehicles. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, watching as the phantom truck continued its relentless approach. part of me wanted to speed up, to put some distance between myself and whatever was following me. But another part of me was curious about the identity of the other driver. Maybe it was just someone with a passion for vintage trucks, or perhaps an owner-operator who couldn't afford to upgrade to newer equipment. There could be any number of perfectly rational explanations for what I was seeing. But as the truck drew alongside me, matching my speed with an engine that groaned and wheezed like something on the verge of mechanical failure, I caught a glimpse of the driver that made my blood run cold. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his pale, skeletal hands gripping the wheel with a death grip that suggested he had been driving for far longer than any human being should attempt. His head hung low, almost touching the dashboard, as if he lacked the strength to hold it upright. I stared in horror as the phantom truck maintained its position beside me, its ancient engine roaring with a sound that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Every time the headlights flickered and dimmed, the driver's figure seemed to shift and change, as if he wasn't entirely solid, or was existing in some state between life and death. The sight filled me with a terror so profound that it seemed to reach into my chest and squeeze my heart with icy fingers. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, desperate to escape whatever supernatural presence had decided to pace me through the Montana wilderness. My truck responded with a surge of power, the speedometer climbing as I pushed the limits of safe driving on the dark highway. But no matter how fast I went, the phantom truck stayed right beside me, its decrepit engine somehow keeping pace despite the obvious signs of mechanical decay and supernatural order. The nightmare seemed to go on forever, though it probably lasted only minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom truck veered sharply off the road, disappearing into the darkness beyond the highway as if it had never existed at all. I watched in my mirrors as it vanished completely, leaving no trace of its passage except for the memory of those hollow, lifeless eyes and the skeletal hands that had guided it through the night. I didn't slow down for miles, my heart still pounding and my hands slick with perspiration as I gripped the steering wheel. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a truck stop, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, trying to process what I had experienced and convince myself that it had been nothing more than a hallucination brought on by fatigue and too many hours on the road. But deep down I knew that what I had seen was real as the asphalt beneath my tires and the stars overhead. I had encountered something that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death, something that roamed the highways in search of what? Companionship? Revenge? Or perhaps just the endless continuation of a journey that had begun decades ago and would never truly end. From that night forward, I became a different kind of driver. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking my mirrors for signs of phantom headlights following me through the darkness. I would listen more carefully to the CB radio, hoping to hear the voices of other living drivers rather than the whispered communications of the dead. And every time I drove through Montana, I would remember that skeletal figure slumped over the wheel of a truck that should have been scrapped decades ago, still driving the highways in search of something that could never be found. The road has many secrets, and not all of them are meant for the living to discover. Some journeys continue long after the driver should have reached his final destination, and some trucks keep rolling even after their engines should have fallen silent forever. I learned that lesson on a dark stretch of Interstate 90, and it's a knowledge that I carry with me every time I climb behind the wheel and head out into the night, where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes as thin as the yellow lines that divide the lanes. Story 6. The Lights in the Desert. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, and there's one thing I've learned from driving through countless nights in the middle of nowhere. The road has a way of playing tricks on your mind. It can make you see things, hear things, and experience phenomena that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. The isolation, the darkness, the endless miles of empty highway, they all combine to create an environment where the impossible suddenly becomes possible, and the line between the natural and supernatural becomes as blurred as the horizon at twilight. The night I'm about to tell you about still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. I've tried to bury the memory, tried to convince myself that it was just another case of road-induced hallucination or fatigue-driven paranoia. But some experiences leave marks on your soul that never fade, no matter how much time passes or how desperately you want to forget what you've witnessed. It was about 6 years ago, somewhere in the vast emptiness of New Mexico, on a lonely stretch of Highway 285 that cuts through some of the most desolate landscape in the American Southwest. I'd been on the road for hours, hauling a load of electronics from Tucson to Denver, making my way through the desert darkness under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The assignment was routine enough, just another delivery that would help me make my monthly truck payments and keep food on the table. It was just after midnight when the radio stations started cutting out one by one, leaving me with nothing but static and the occasional fragment of distant voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify. The CB radio was equally quiet, picking up nothing but the empty hiss of unused frequencies, as if every other driver on the continent had simply vanished into thin air. The silence was both peaceful and unsettling, creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed to press in around my truck like a physical presence. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie glow over the desert landscape that transformed familiar shapes into mysterious silhouettes. The vast stretches of sand and scrub brush seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional mesa or rock formation that stood like ancient sentinels against the star-filled sky. It was beautiful in a desolate kind of way, the kind of raw, untamed beauty that can only be found in places where human civilization has barely left a mark. I'd been listening to music to keep myself alert and focused, but as the miles ticked by, the stations began cutting out one by one, until I was left with nothing but static. I tried scanning for other frequencies, but every channel seemed to be filled with the same empty white noise, as if something was interfering with radio transmissions across the entire region. Eventually, I gave up and settled for the hypnotic rhythm of my diesel engine and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. That's when the CB radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me out of my meditative state. The voice that came through the speakers was faint and distant, barely audible above the background static, like someone calling out from very far away. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" The transmission was weak and broken, cutting in and out as if the speaker was at the very edge of the radio's range. I picked up the microphone, grateful for any human contact after hours of isolation. "This is Red Fox. I copy. Who's out there?" I waited for a response, hoping to connect with another driver who might be making the same lonely journey through the desert night. There was a long pause filled with nothing but static, and then the voice returned, clearer this time but somehow colder and more distant than before. "Do you see it?" The question was simple enough, but something about the way it was asked made my stomach tighten, with an inexplicable sense of dread. "See what?" I responded, frowning as I tried to understand what the other driver was referring to. "Who is this?" But the radio had gone dead again, leaving me alone with my questions and a growing feeling that something was not quite right about this seemingly innocent exchange. I tried to dismiss the strange conversation and focus on the road ahead, but the mysterious question kept echoing in my mind. See what? What was I supposed to be looking for out here in the middle of the desert? I found myself scanning the horizon more carefully, searching the darkness for anything unusual or out of place, though I had no idea what I might discover. The highway stretched on through the night, as empty and desolate as ever, until I spotted something in the distance that made me slow down and lean forward in my seat. There was a vehicle of some kind on the side of the road ahead, sitting motionless with its hazard lights blinking weakly in the darkness. As I drew closer, I could see that it was a truck, an old semi that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. At first I thought it might be a breakdown situation, and my natural instinct was to stop and offer assistance. It wasn't unusual to encounter disabled vehicles on these remote stretches of highway, and the unwritten code of the road dictated that drivers should help each other whenever possible. But as I pulled up beside the disabled truck, something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong in ways that I couldn't immediately explain. The truck was ancient, much older than anything you'd expect to see in active service on modern highways. The paint was chipped and faded, worn away by decades of desert sun and wind, and the trailer looked like it hadn't been maintained or cleaned in years. Rust had eaten away at much of the metal surface, and the overall condition of the vehicle suggested that it had been abandoned in this spot for a very long time. I stopped my own rig and rolled down the window, calling out to see if anyone needed help. "Hey, you need a hand?" My voice echoed strangely in the desert air, seeming to be absorbed by the darkness rather than carrying very far. There was no response from the other truck, and I couldn't see any sign of a driver or passengers in the cab. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of my truck, feeling the dry desert air hit me like a physical wall. The night was unusually still, without even the slightest breeze to stir the sparse vegetation, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I walked cautiously toward the disabled truck, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I tried to get a better look at the situation. The cab appeared to be empty, with no signs of recent occupation. The keys were still in the ignition, but the engine was cold and obviously hadn't been running for quite some time. As I got closer, I became aware of a smell that made my stomach turn. A sickly, rotting odor that seemed to be emanating from somewhere nearby, growing stronger with each step I took toward the back of the trailer. Against every instinct that told me to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as possible, I found myself drawn toward the source of that terrible smell. The trailer doors were secured with a simple latch, but my hands shook as I reached for the mechanism, knowing somehow that whatever I found inside would change me forever in ways I couldn't yet imagine. When I finally opened the doors, the smell hit me with such intensity that I nearly vomited on the spot. The trailer appeared to be empty at first glance, just a dark, cavernous space that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam, but the odor was so overwhelming that I knew something was definitely wrong with this entire situation. I shined my light into the far corners of the trailer, and that's when I saw them. Huddled in the deepest shadows at the back of the cargo space were figures that might once have been human beings, but were now something else entirely. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent and angular to belong to living people. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting my flashlight beam like mirrors, and their mouths were open in expressions of silent screaming that spoke of unimaginable terror and suffering. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. These weren't bodies in any conventional sense, they were something else. Something that existed in the space between life and death, trapped in an eternal state of horror and despair. They didn't move or speak, but I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl and my primitive survival instincts scream warnings. I slammed the trailer doors shut and ran back to my truck, not bothering to look back or try to understand what I had discovered. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that place as possible, as quickly as my diesel engine could carry me. I threw the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the sandy shoulder before finding purchase on the asphalt. But as I sped away from that nightmare scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving it behind. In my rearview mirror, I could see lights beginning to appear in the desert. Not the normal lights of vehicles or buildings, but strange, pulsing orbs that seemed to float above the landscape without any visible source or support. The lights followed me for miles, staying just at the edge of my vision, but never getting close enough for me to make out any details. They moved with a fluid grace that defied explanation, weaving through the air like living things rather than mechanical objects. Sometimes they would disappear entirely, only to reappear in a different part of the sky, as if they were playing some kind of cosmic game of hide and seek. I drove faster than was safe on that dark highway, desperate to outrun whatever supernatural presence had decided to pursue me through the New Mexico desert. The lights continued their strange dance behind me, sometimes appearing as single orbs, other times clustering together in formations that reminded me of constellations, or geometric patterns that held meanings I couldn't begin to understand. Eventually, after what felt like hours of this supernatural chase, the lights began to fade and disappear, leaving me alone once again with nothing but the normal darkness of the desert night. When I finally reached the next town and pulled into a well-lit truck stop, I sat in my cab for a long time, trying to convince myself that the entire experience had been nothing more than a fatigue-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road, that I knew in my heart that what I had seen was real as the steering wheel in my hands and the diesel fuel in my tank. I had stumbled upon something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world and our place in it. The desert holds many secrets, and that night I discovered that some of them are not meant for human eyes to witness. To this day, I avoid that stretch of Highway 285 whenever possible, taking longer routes that add hours to my travel time, but allow me to sleep peacefully without wondering what might be watching me from the darkness beyond my headlights. Some encounters leave permanent marks on your soul, and my meeting with those pale figures and mysterious lights was definitely one of them. Story 7. The Trucker Who Never Left. I've been hauling freight across the highways of America for nearly 20 years, and in that time, I've learned that some roads hold more than just asphalt and painted lines. They hold memories, echoes of the countless travelers who have passed over them, and sometimes those echoes take on a life of their own. The story I'm about to tell you happened on one of those roads, a forgotten stretch of highway that exists in the spaces between major routes, where time moves differently, and the normal rules of reality don't always apply. It was a job like any other when it started. I was hauling a load of lumber from Kansas City to a construction site in Oregon, following a route that would take me through some of the most remote and beautiful parts of the American West. The trip was scheduled to span several days, with mandatory rest stops and careful attention to the hours of service regulations that govern our industry. This was the second day of the journey, and I was making good time despite the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather that had been following me since crossing into the mountain states. When my dispatcher radioed in with an unexpected route change, I wasn't particularly concerned. Highway closures and detours are a normal part of long-distance trucking, and experienced drivers learn to adapt to changing conditions without losing their composure or their schedules. "Got a detour for you," his voice crackled through the CB with the usual mixture of authority and casual indifference. "Highway 84 is closed due to a serious accident. Take the old 74 north instead. It's longer, but it'll get you there." The old 74. I'd heard stories about that road over the years, whispered conversations in truck stops and diners where drivers gathered to share their experiences and warn each other about the hazards of various routes. It was notorious among truckers for being long, winding, and desolate, cutting through some of the most isolated territory in the region. But I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, a road is just a road, and I'd driven through plenty of remote areas during my career without encountering anything more dangerous than bad weather or aggressive drivers. I pulled off the interstate and found myself on a highway that immediately felt different from the modern, well-maintained routes I was accustomed to traveling. The pavement was narrower and older, with faded markings and numerous cracks and potholes that suggested it hadn't seen major maintenance in years. The shoulders were minimal, barely wide enough for emergency stops, and the guardrails looked like they dated back several decades. But the load I was carrying wasn't time-sensitive, and I figured I could afford to take my time navigating the challenging road conditions. Sometimes the scenic routes make up for their inconveniences with beautiful landscapes and a sense of adventure that the interstate highways can't provide. I settled in for what I expected to be a longer but ultimately routine drive through the mountains and valleys of the American West. As the night crept on, the road stretched ahead like a ribbon of black, with nothing but wilderness on either side. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren landscape that seemed to shift and move in ways that defied explanation. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only the stretch of road directly ahead, while everything beyond that narrow cone of light remained mysterious and unknown. For miles, I didn't see another vehicle, not even the distant glow of taillights or the brief flash of oncoming headlights. It felt like I was driving into the abyss, as if the highway was swallowing me whole and carrying me into some realm that existed outside normal space and time. The radio had long since lost all signal, leaving me with nothing but static and the steady rumble of my diesel engine for company. About 3 hours into this detour, something strange began to happen. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, expecting it to read around 1 a.m., but instead, the display was showing random numbers that made no sense. 3.87, 2.63, and other combinations that couldn't possibly represent any actual time. I figured it was just an electrical glitch since my truck wasn't exactly new and electronics can be unreliable in remote areas where atmospheric conditions might interfere with normal operations. But when my radio cut out at exactly the same moment, displaying the same kind of nonsensical numbers on its digital readout, I started to feel a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Complete silence filled the cab except for the rumble of the engine, and even that seemed muted and distant, as if it was reaching me from very far away. I tried switching to different radio stations, but all I could find was static that seemed to pulse and breathe like something alive. As I continued driving through this electronic dead zone, I began to notice that the road itself was behaving in ways that defied the normal laws of geography and engineering. The highway, which had been relatively straight for miles, began to twist and turn in unnatural ways that didn't match the terrain around it. The curves were too sharp and too frequent, as if the asphalt was deliberately winding itself into tighter and tighter spirals, like a snake coiling around its prey. I slowed down considerably, gripping the steering wheel tighter as I tried to maintain control on these impossible curves. The truck's headlights swept back and forth across a landscape that seemed to change each time the light touched it, revealing rock formations and vegetation that shouldn't have been able to exist in this climate or elevation. Nothing about the environment made sense anymore, and I was beginning to suspect that I had somehow left the normal world behind and entered something far stranger and more dangerous. That's when I saw the figure in the distance. At first it was just a small dark shape far ahead on the shoulder of the road, barely visible in the reach of my headlights. I assumed it was probably a hitchhiker, though it seemed strange to encounter anyone out here in the middle of this desolate wilderness at such a late hour. As I got closer, the figure became clearer, resolving into the shape of a man standing perfectly still, facing away from me. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked like something from the 1950s, a dusty, tattered suit that had obviously seen better days, and a wide-brimmed fedora that cast his face in shadow. But what really caught my attention was his posture, the way he stood so absolutely motionless as if he had been frozen in place for decades or centuries. He didn't move as my truck approached, didn't turn to acknowledge the sound of my engine or the glare of my headlights. Something about the man felt fundamentally wrong, in ways that I couldn't articulate, but that my primitive survival instincts recognized immediately. He wasn't just someone who had been stranded or was seeking assistance. He was something else entirely. Something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. I slowed the truck down even more, squinting into the darkness as I tried to get a better look at this mysterious figure. The man remained completely still as I passed him, never turning to look at my truck or showing any sign that he was aware of my presence. His stillness was unnatural, like that of a statue or mannequin rather than a living person, and there was something about the way his clothes hung on his frame that suggested they were covering something that wasn't entirely human. I couldn't see his face beneath the brim of his hat but I could feel his attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I kept driving, watching the figure fade in my rearview mirrors as I put distance between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter was far from over. The image of that motionless man in his ancient suit was burned into my memory, and I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me or somehow keeping pace with my truck, despite having no visible means of transportation. 10 minutes later I saw him again. This time he was closer to the road, standing just at the edge of the pavement as if he had somehow gotten ahead of me while I was driving. I hit the brakes instinctively, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I fought to maintain control of the heavy rig. There was no way he could have moved from his previous position to this new location in such a short time, not without some kind of vehicle. But there he was, standing in exactly the same position with the same unnatural stillness. This time I didn't just drive past. I pulled the truck over to the shoulder and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the cool night air with my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to understand what was happening. Needed to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind or suffering from some kind of fatigue-induced hallucination. The man stood about 20 feet away, and as I approached him with my flashlight raised, I could see more details that only deepened the mystery. His clothes were covered in dust and something else, something dark and wet that had soaked into the fabric and dried there over what looked like years of exposure to the elements. His skin was pale, too pale for someone who spent time outdoors, and it had a waxy, artificial quality that reminded me of the mannequins you might see in old department store windows. But it was when he finally turned to face me that I truly understood the horror of what I was dealing with. His face was a nightmare of decay and supernatural malevolence. The skin was stretched too tight over bones that seemed too prominent and angular, and his eyes were completely black, like pools of oil that reflected my flashlight beam without revealing anything of what lay behind them. His smile was the worst part. His lips were pulled back into a wide, unnatural grin that revealed teeth that were too sharp and too white, as if they had been filed to points by some demented craftsman. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking as I tried to keep the flashlight steady, but the man, or whatever he was, didn't move toward me. He just smiled, that horrible smile, and stared at me with those black, empty eyes, as if he was evaluating me for some purpose I couldn't begin to understand. The air around him felt colder than it should have, and there was an oppressive weight to his presence that made it difficult to breathe normally. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I backed toward my truck, fumbling for the door handle while keeping the flashlight pointed at him. Only when I was safely inside the cab with the doors locked did I allow myself to look away, and when I glanced back through the windshield, he was gone. Not walking away, not moving in any direction, simply absent, as if he had never been there at all. I started the engine and drove away from that spot as quickly as the road conditions would allow, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was still being watched. The man's image was burned into my retinas, and every time I blinked, I could see his terrible smile and those black, soulless eyes staring back at me. The road continued to twist and turn in impossible ways, leading me deeper into a landscape that bore no resemblance to any map I had ever seen. Hours passed in this nightmarish journey, and just when I thought I might be trapped forever in this supernatural maze, I began to see signs of normal civilization returning. Mile markers appeared that actually made sense. My radio picked up recognizable stations, and my dashboard clock resumed displaying the correct time. By dawn, I was back on familiar highways, delivering my load as if nothing unusual had happened. But I never forgot that night on the old 74, and I made sure to research the history of that road when I had the opportunity. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The highway had been the site of numerous disappearances over the years, travelers who had simply vanished without a trace while traveling through that remote area. Local folklore spoke of a man in old-fashioned clothes who appeared to stranded motorists, always wearing the same tattered suit and wide-brimmed hat, always smiling, that terrible smile. Some said he was the ghost of a traveling salesman who had died on that road decades ago and was doomed to wander there forever. Others claimed he was something far more sinister, a supernatural predator that fed on the fear and life force of those unfortunate enough to encounter him. Whatever the truth might be, I knew that I had come face to face with something that existed outside the normal world, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality and the laws that govern our universe. I never took that route again, and I warn other drivers to avoid the old 74 whenever possible. Some roads are meant to be forgotten, left to fade away into the wilderness where they can no longer harm the living. But I suspect that road will continue to exist as long as there are travelers to lure into its supernatural embrace, and that the man in the tattered suit will keep waiting there, smiling his horrible smile and watching for the next victim to wander into his domain. Story 8. The Emergency at Pine Grove. I've been a long-haul trucker for almost 20 years, and in that time, I've learned to expect the unexpected on America's highways. You spend enough nights driving through remote areas where civilization feels like a distant memory, and you start to understand that the world is full of mysteries that can't be explained by logic or science. The story I'm about to tell you happened on a chilly October evening that began like any other, routine haul, but ended with an encounter that changed my understanding of what's possible in the dark spaces between towns. I had just picked up a load of medical supplies in Los Angeles, destined for a small hospital in Northern California. The cargo was standard pharmaceutical equipment and medications, nothing particularly valuable or dangerous, just the kind of essential supplies that keep rural medical facilities operational. The dispatcher had recommended taking Highway 5 north, which would have been the fastest and most direct route, but I decided to take what I thought was a shortcut through the mountains. I had driven similar routes before and figured I could save some time by avoiding the heavy traffic that typically clogs the main interstate during evening hours. The mountain road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forests of pine and oak that seemed to close in around my truck like living walls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world around me fell into the deep darkness that only exists in remote wilderness areas, far from the light pollution of cities and towns. I switched on my headlights and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful drive through some of the most beautiful countryside in California. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles and earth, carrying that distinctive smell of autumn that makes you want to roll down the windows and breathe deeply despite the chill. I tried tuning the radio to find some music to keep me company, but the mountainous terrain interfered with reception, leaving me with nothing but static and the occasional fragment of distant voices that faded in and out like ghostly whispers. About an hour into the mountain drive, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, following me much more closely than was safe or courteous on such a narrow, winding road. The vehicle behind me seemed to be matching my speed exactly, staying just close enough to make me nervous, but not close enough for me to get a good look at what kind of car or truck it was. I tried to give the other driver the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe they were just unfamiliar with mountain driving or were in a hurry to reach their destination. I sped up slightly, hoping they would either pass me or back off to a more reasonable following distance, but the headlights stayed right where they were, maintaining that same uncomfortably close position that made my nerves stand on edge. After several minutes of this tense situation, the vehicle behind me suddenly swerved to the side and pulled up next to my truck, despite the obvious danger of such a maneuver on the narrow mountain road. I glanced over, expecting to see an impatient driver or perhaps someone who needed assistance, but what I saw instead defied all logic and reason. The vehicle was an old pickup truck that looked like it had rolled off an assembly line in the 1960s, with rusted fenders and a cracked windshield that suggested decades of hard use and neglect. But the most disturbing thing about it was the driver, or rather, the complete absence of a driver. The cab was empty, yet the steering wheel was turning on its own, making precise adjustments to keep the truck perfectly aligned with my rig despite the challenging road conditions. I I stared in disbelief as the phantom truck kept pace with me, its ancient engine roaring with a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the mechanical world. There was no one behind the wheel, no hands gripping the steering wheel, no foot pressing the accelerator, just an empty cab guiding itself through the mountain curves with supernatural precision. The headlights cast an eerie glow on the trees around us, and I could see that the truck's paint was faded and peeling, as if it had been abandoned in the wilderness for decades. My rational mind tried to find some explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of experimental autonomous vehicle, or perhaps a remote-controlled demonstration that I had stumbled into by accident. But deep down, I knew that what I was witnessing had nothing to do with technology or human innovation. This was something else entirely, something that existed outside the normal boundaries of reality. The phantom truck stayed beside me for what felt like an eternity, though it could have only been a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it veered off the road and disappeared into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with a sound like breaking glass and twisted metal. I expected to see flames or wreckage, but there was nothing. Just the darkness of the trees and the memory of an impossible encounter that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I didn't stop to investigate. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get as far away from that place as possible, and I pressed down harder on the accelerator, pushing my truck to its limits as I navigated the twisting mountain road. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it over the rumble of the diesel engine. Miles passed in a blur of adrenaline and fear, until I finally saw the welcome glow of lights ahead, a small mountain town nestled in a valley between the peaks. I had never been so grateful to see signs of human civilization, and I pulled into the first gas station I found, parking my rig with hands that were still trembling from the supernatural encounter I had just experienced. The station was old and rustic, with weathered wooden buildings and antique gas pumps that looked like they belonged in a museum. The attendant was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, who looked up from his newspaper as I walked through the door. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a concerned smile. "Everything all right?" I almost laughed at the accuracy of his observation, but instead I just asked for directions to the nearest highway that would take me back to my original route. As I was paying for gas, I mentioned the strange encounter I had just experienced, describing the phantom truck and its impossible behavior on the mountain road. The attendant's expression grew serious, and he nodded slowly, as if my story was nothing unusual. "You're not the first driver to see him on that stretch of road," he said quietly. "Local folks call him the mountain driver, supposed to be the ghost of a trucker who died in an accident up there about 30 years ago. They say he's still trying to make his delivery, still driving the same route he was on when he crashed." The explanation sent chills down my spine, but it also provided a strange kind of comfort. I wasn't losing my mind, and I wasn't the only person to have encountered this supernatural presence on the mountain road. The attendant gave me detailed directions for an alternate route that would avoid the haunted stretch of highway, and I gratefully followed his advice. The rest of my journey passed without incident, and I delivered my cargo on schedule the next morning. But I never forgot that night in the mountains when I learned that some drivers never reach their final destination, condemned to keep making the same run over and over again for reasons that only they understand. The mountain roads of California hold many secrets, and that night I discovered that some of them involve travelers who refuse to accept that their journey has come to an end. I still drive through mountainous areas when my job requires it, but I'm much more careful about which routes I choose and what time of day I travel them. Some roads are best left to their permanent residents, those eternal drivers who continue their routes long after their earthly concerns should have ended. The mountain driver taught me that death is not always the final destination, and that some journeys continue in ways that the living cannot fully comprehend. Story 9. The Voice on Highway 40. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, and in that time, I've learned that the open road can be both a blessing and a curse. There's freedom in the endless miles and the ever-changing landscape, but there's also a darkness that lurks just beyond the reach of your headlights, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to those of us who make our living in the space between night and day. It was a chilly night in late November when I experienced something that still gives me nightmares. An encounter that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and the boundaries between the living and the dead. I was driving my usual route along Highway 40, a long stretch that cuts through some of the most desolate areas in the American Southwest, carrying a heavy load of frozen goods bound for a small grocery chain in a remote town that most people have never heard of. The air was crisp and clean, with that distinctive bite that comes with approaching winter, and the moon hung low in the sky like a pale disk, casting eerie shadows on the asphalt ahead. My rig was loaded with holiday merchandise that needed to reach its destination before the final shopping rush began, but the deadlines were reasonable and I was making good time despite the challenging weather conditions that had been forecast for the region. As the hours ticked by and the landscape grew more barren and isolated, fatigue began to set in with that familiar weight that every long-distance driver knows well. The road stretched endlessly before me like a ribbon of black leading into nothingness, and the hypnotic rhythm of the tires on asphalt was starting to make my eyelids feel heavy. I knew I would need to take a break soon, but I wanted to push through to the next major truck stop where I could get some coffee and stretch my legs properly. Around midnight, I decided to take a quick break at a rest area that I had passed many times before on this route. It was nothing fancy, just a small parking area with basic facilities and a few weathered picnic tables, but it would serve my purposes for a brief stop. I parked my rig and stepped out into the cold night air, grateful for the opportunity to move around and clear my head before continuing the journey. The rest area was completely deserted, which wasn't surprising given the hour and the remote location. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a night bird somewhere in the darkness beyond the parking area. I walked around my truck for a few minutes, checking the tires and cargo straps out of habit more than necessity, when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was an old pickup truck parked in one of the far spaces, its engine running despite the fact that there was no one visible inside the cab. The vehicle looked like it had seen better days, with rust spots and dented fenders that suggested years of hard use. But what really caught my attention was the way it just sat there, idling in the darkness, as if waiting for something or someone that might never come. I approached the truck cautiously, thinking maybe the driver had stepped away for a moment and would return shortly. But as I got closer, I could see that the cab was definitely empty, and there were no signs of recent occupation. The keys were in the ignition, the engine was running smoothly, but there was absolutely no indication of where the driver might have gone or when they might return. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stood there staring at the mysterious vehicle. Something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit with the rest of the picture. I decided to get back to my own truck and continue my journey as quickly as possible, but as I turned to walk away, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the owner of the pickup truck returning from the restroom, or perhaps another driver who had arrived while I was distracted. But the parking area was still empty, and the footsteps had stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The only movement was the gentle swaying of tree branches in the night breeze, and the only sounds were the distant hum of highway traffic and the steady idle of the mysterious truck. My rational mind tried to find logical explanations for what I was experiencing. Maybe the footsteps had been an echo from the highway, or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush beyond the rest area. But my primitive survival instincts were screaming warnings that something was very wrong with this place, and that I needed to leave immediately before whatever was lurking in the darkness decided to reveal itself. I hurried back to my rig and climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind me out of an abundance of caution that I couldn't fully explain. As I started the engine and prepared to leave, I glanced in my rearview mirror one more time at the idling pickup truck. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing beside it. A tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to be watching my departure with an attention that felt both malevolent and hungry. But when I looked again, adjusting the mirror to get a better view, there was nothing there except the empty truck and the darkness beyond the parking area. I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, pressing down harder on the accelerator than was probably necessary in my eagerness to put distance between myself and that unsettling encounter. For the next few miles, I tried to convince myself that the entire experience had been nothing more than a tired driver's overactive imagination combined with the natural eeriness of a deserted rest area in the middle of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something had taken note of my presence and was following me as I continued down the dark highway. That's when I began to notice the lights in my rearview mirror. At first, they were just faint pinpricks in the distance, barely visible against the black backdrop of the night sky. I assumed they belonged to another vehicle that had been traveling the same route, perhaps the owner of the mysterious pickup truck who had finally returned to claim their vehicle and continue their own journey. But as the lights grew closer, I began to realize that they were moving in ways that defied the normal behavior of automobile headlights. They flickered and pulsed irregularly, sometimes appearing as two distinct points of light, other times merging into a single glowing orb that seemed to float above the road surface. The movement was too fluid, too organic to be coming from any conventional vehicle. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, trying to outrun whatever was pursuing me through the Nevada desert. My truck responded with a surge of power, the speedometer climbing as I pushed the limits of safe driving on the dark highway. But no matter how fast I went, the mysterious lights continued to gain on me, growing larger and brighter with each passing mile. The pursuit continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The lights behind me began to take on different colors, sometimes white, sometimes blue or green, occasionally a deep red that reminded me of warning signals or emergency beacons. They moved with an intelligence that suggested they were being controlled by some kind of consciousness, weaving back and forth across the highway as if they were playing with me, testing my reactions and measuring my fear. And just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more terrifying, the lights suddenly shot forward, passing my truck on the left side and taking up a position directly ahead of me on the highway. I could see them clearly now through my windshield. 3 distinct orbs of brilliant white light that hovered about 10 feet above the road surface, pulsing in a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat or breathing pattern. I slammed on the brakes, bringing my rig to a skidding halt in the middle of the empty highway. The lights remained stationary for a moment, as if waiting to see what I would do next, then began to move in a slow, deliberate circle around my truck. As they moved, I could hear a low, humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the metal of my cab and resonating in my bones, like some kind of otherworldly music. The experience lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights shot straight up into the night sky and disappeared among the stars, leaving me alone on the dark highway with nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing and the steady idle of my diesel engine. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened and convince myself that it had been real rather than some kind of stress-induced hallucination. When I finally felt calm enough to continue driving, I noticed that my CB radio was crackling with activity for the first time all night. Voices were coming through the static, other drivers sharing their own encounters with unexplained phenomena on the highways of the Southwest. "Anyone else see those lights over Highway 40? Came one voice, tense with excitement and fear. 3 of them, moving like nothing I've ever seen before. "Roger that," replied another driver. "Saw them about 20 minutes ago, somewhere around mile marker 247. Thought I was losing my mind." I picked up my microphone to join the conversation, grateful to discover that I wasn't the only one who had witnessed the impossible events of that night. We talked for nearly an hour, sharing our experiences and trying to make sense of what we had all seen. Some drivers had encountered similar phenomena on other routes, while others had heard stories from fellow truckers about lights that appeared without warning and disappeared just as mysteriously. The conversation helped calm my nerves and restore my confidence in my own sanity, but it also opened my eyes to a reality that I had never fully appreciated before. The highways of America are home to mysteries that science cannot explain, phenomena that exist at the edges of human understanding and challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality. I completed my delivery without further incident, but the memory of those lights and the way they moved with apparent intelligence has stayed with me ever since. I've become more aware of the strange stories that circulate among truck drivers, more willing to listen when someone shares an encounter that defies conventional explanation. The road holds many secrets, and that night on Highway 40, I learned that some of them are not meant for human comprehension. Story 10: The Endless Loop. I've been a long-haul trucker for nearly 20 years, traversing the lonely highways that connect the far-flung corners of our vast country. In all that time, I've learned to appreciate both the beauty and the danger that can be found on America's roads, from the stunning sunrises over prairie landscapes to the treacherous mountain passes that test a driver's skill and courage. But of all the experiences I've had during my career, none has haunted me more than what happened on a seemingly ordinary night drive through Montana, when I discovered that some roads exist outside the normal boundaries of space and time. It was late October, and the air carried that distinctive chill that signals the approaching winter season. I was on my way to deliver a load of construction supplies to a small town in northern Montana, following a route that would take me through some of the most sparsely populated territory in the lower 48 states. The assignment was routine enough, just building materials that needed to reach their destination before the first major snowfall made transportation more difficult and expensive. The sun had set hours earlier, leaving me alone with the stars and the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched ahead into the darkness. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating only the immediate stretch of road while everything beyond remained shrouded in mystery. The landscape on either side was vast and empty, broken only by the occasional silhouette of a hill or the distant twinkle of lights from some isolated farmhouse or ranch. Traffic was virtually non-existent on this remote stretch of highway, which wasn't unusual for the late-night hours when most sensible people were home in their beds. Occasionally, I would see the headlights of another vehicle in the distance, but for the most part it was just me, my truck, and the hypnotic rhythm of tires on asphalt that has lulled countless drivers into the meditative state that makes long-distance hauling bearable. My radio was picking up only static from the few stations that reached this remote area, and the CB was equally quiet, suggesting that I was the only driver crazy enough to be navigating these lonely roads at such an hour. The silence was both peaceful and slightly unnerving, creating an atmosphere of isolation that made me more aware than usual of every sound my truck made and every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision. Around midnight, something began to feel different about the road I was traveling. At first, I couldn't put my finger on exactly what had changed, but there was a subtle shift in the environment that made my primitive survival instincts start to pay closer attention to my surroundings. The highway seemed to be curving more than I remembered from previous trips through this area, and the mile markers that I passed seemed to be spaced irregularly, sometimes appearing much sooner than expected and other times taking much longer to appear. I checked my GPS navigation system, but the screen was showing nothing but a blank map with a blinking dot that represented my truck's position floating in an empty void. The electronic compass was spinning randomly, unable to determine which direction I was heading, and the odometer seemed to be counting miles at a rate that didn't match my actual speed or the passage of time. A cold feeling began to settle in my stomach as I realized that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. I had driven this route many times before and knew it like the back of my hand, but nothing about the current journey felt familiar or predictable. The road was taking me through territory that I didn't recognize, past landmarks that shouldn't have existed in this part of Montana. Then I saw the mile marker that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Standing beside the road, clearly illuminated by my headlights, was a weathered sign that read, Mile 0. This made absolutely no sense, since I was hundreds of miles from the beginning of this particular highway, and I had been driving for hours through what should have been increasingly higher numbered mile markers. I slowed my truck to a crawl, staring at the impossible sign and trying to understand how I could have ended up at mile 0 when I should have been approaching mile 300 or higher. My speedometer was working normally. My engine was running smoothly, and there were no mechanical problems that might explain this discrepancy. Yet here I was, apparently, back at the beginning of a highway that I had been traveling for most of the night. I continued driving, hoping that the next mile marker would show a more reasonable number, and that I could dismiss this anomaly as a mistake or a prank by local teenagers with too much time on their hands. But when the next marker appeared, it also read mile 0, identical to the first one in every detail. Then came another, and another, each one bearing the same impossible number, each one marking a mile that shouldn't have existed. Panic began to bubble up in my chest as I realized that I was somehow trapped in a loop, driving the same stretch of highway over and over again without making any real progress toward my destination. The road ahead looked exactly the same as it had hours earlier, with the same curves, the same landmarks, and the same endless expanse of darkness on either side. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, and distance had become a concept that no longer applied to my situation. I tried radioing for help on the CB, but all I could pick up was static mixed with faint voices that seemed to be speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The words were just at the edge of comprehension, like conversations overheard through thick walls or across great distances. Sometimes the voices seemed to be calling my name, but when I listened more carefully, the sounds dissolved back into meaningless noise. My truck's clock had stopped working properly, displaying random times that bore no relationship to when I had started my journey or how long I had been driving. The fuel gauge showed a full tank despite the fact that I should have been running low after hours of driving, and the engine temperature remained constant even though the outside air was getting colder with each passing mile. Hour after hour, I continued to encounter the same mile 0 markers, the same curves in the road, the same patches of darkness that stretched away into the unknown. I began to feel like a rat in a maze, running the same pattern over and over again while some unseen observer watched my increasingly desperate attempts to find an exit from this supernatural trap. Then I started to see the other vehicles. At first they were just brief glimpses in my peripheral vision, headlights that appeared and disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I was imagining them. But as time passed, the sightings became more frequent and more distinct. Old trucks and cars from different eras would materialize out of the darkness, traveling the same endless loop that had captured me. Some of the vehicles looked like they were from the 1950S or 1960S, with the distinctive styling and chrome details of automotive design from decades past. Others appeared to be more recent models, but all of them had one thing in common. They were trapped in the same impossible cycle that had ensnared my own truck. The drivers were visible as shadowy figures behind their windshields, but their faces were obscured by darkness or distance, making it impossible to make contact or determine their identities. I began to understand that I had somehow wandered into a place where normal rules didn't apply, where time moved in circles rather than straight lines, and where distance was measured in repetition rather than miles. This stretch of highway existed outside the normal flow of reality, a supernatural trap that captured unwary travelers and held them in an eternal cycle of futile motion. The worst part was the growing realization that some of the other vehicles I was seeing had probably been trapped in this loop for decades, their drivers condemned to repeat the same journey over and over again for reasons that defied all logic and understanding. The thought that I might join their ranks, becoming another phantom traveler on an impossible road, filled me with a terror so profound that it threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. I tried everything I could think of to break free from this supernatural prison. I attempted to turn around and drive in the opposite direction, but the roads seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, with no exit ramps or side roads that might offer escape. I had tried stopping my truck completely and waiting to see if the loop would reset itself, but time seemed to have stopped along with my vehicle, creating a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the cab. When I started driving again, I was right back where I had been before, passing the same mile zero markers and seeing the same phantom vehicles traveling their eternal routes through the darkness. The fuel gauge still showed full, the clock still displayed random numbers, and my GPS continued to show nothing but an empty void where the map should have been. Hours passed, or perhaps days. It was impossible to tell in a place where time had lost all meaning. I began to see the same ghost vehicles repeatedly, as if they were following their own predetermined schedules within the loop. There was an old pickup truck from the 1940S that always appeared at a certain curve in the road, a sedan from the 1970S that materialized near a particular mile marker, and a modern SUV that seemed to be driven by a family whose faces I could never quite make out through the tinted windows. Just when I thought I would be trapped forever in this nightmarish cycle, something changed. I was approaching what I had come to think of as the beginning of the loop, the place where I always encountered the first mile zero marker, when I noticed something different about the road ahead. There was a faint glow on the horizon, not the cold light of stars or moon, but the warm, welcoming glow of human civilization. I pressed down on the accelerator, driving toward that distant light with a desperation born of countless hours trapped in the supernatural maze. As I got closer, the glow resolved itself into the familiar sight of a truck stop, with bright fluorescent lights illuminating the parking area and the blessed normalcy of other vehicles coming and going in the patterns of ordinary commerce and travel. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I sat in my cab for a long time, shaking with relief and trying to process what I had just experienced. My truck's systems had returned to normal. The clock was showing the correct time, the GPS was displaying a proper map, and the fuel gauge indicated that I had used exactly the amount of diesel that should have been consumed during a normal night's driving. I talked to other drivers at the truck stop, asking if anyone had heard stories about strange phenomena on the Montana highways. Most of them just looked at me like I was crazy. But one old-timer nodded knowingly and told me that there were certain stretches of road in the state that had reputations for being wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by conventional science. "Time works different out there," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Some roads don't lead where they're supposed to lead, and some journeys don't end when they should. You're lucky you found your way out. Not everyone does." I completed my delivery the next day, but I never forgot that night when I learned that some highways exist in dimensions parallel to our own, trapping unwary travelers in cycles that have no beginning and no end. I've been more careful about which routes I choose for my late-night drives, and I always make sure to have multiple navigation systems and communication devices as backup, in case I ever find myself in a situation where the normal rules of geography and physics no longer apply. The road holds many mysteries, and that night in Montana I discovered that some of them involve places where travelers can become lost not just in space, but in time itself, condemned to drive the same miles over and over again, until someone or something decides to release them from their supernatural prison. I was fortunate enough to escape that fate, but I know that the loop is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to wander into its embrace and join the eternal convoy of ghost vehicles that travel roads that don't appear on any map. Story 11. The Woman in the Fog. I've spent nearly 20 years on the road as a long-haul trucker, cruising through endless highways, lonely back roads, and the heart of every town along the way. Most nights are peaceful, just me and the gentle hum of the engine, with fellow truckers sharing stories over the CB radio. I've heard countless tales over the years, but nothing prepared me for that fateful night on Highway 54 that would change my life forever. It started like any other run. I was hauling electronics from California to Denver, making decent time through the Sierra Nevada mountains. The autumn air was crisp, filling the cab with the scent of changing seasons. Vibrant orange and red leaves painted the landscape like a living postcard, though the beauty felt distant, almost surreal in the growing twilight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness settled quickly over the mountains. I passed several rest areas, but something urged me to keep going. With enough energy drinks and coffee to fuel a small army, I felt capable of pushing through a few more hours. The mountains were notorious for sudden fog and treacherous driving conditions, and I wanted to clear them before the weather turned. Just before midnight, I entered a stretch where towering trees closed in on both sides, creating a tunnel of shadows that seemed to swallow the road ahead. That's when I first noticed the fog rolling in, thick and deliberate, following the asphalt like a living thing. I turned on my headlights and squinted through the haze as the world outside transformed into a gray blur. My heart rate quickened as I focused intently on the road, feeling as though the fog possessed a mind of its own, wrapping around my truck like a shroud. My CB radio suddenly crackled to life, shattering the silence with static. "Breaker! Breaker! Anyone out there?" A voice called through the interference. "Long Haul 24 here, what's your location?" I responded, relieved to hear another human voice in the isolation. "Out on Highway 54, just past the old gas station. You in the fog too?" The voice was tense, almost frantic in its urgency. "Yeah, just coming up on it," I replied, glancing at my GPS as the display showed my position. "Looks like it's getting pretty thick out here." The voice came back immediately, barely above a whisper now. "Stay alert, man. I just saw something in the fog, something that was watching me. I don't know what it was, but it had eyes that seemed to follow my truck." I chuckled lightly, though unease was creeping over me like a cold draft. Probably just a deer or something. You know how it is out here in the wilderness. But his response sent chills down my spine. No. This was different. I swear it had human eyes, but something was wrong with them. "I'm pulling off at the next exit, and you should too." Despite his warning, I continued down the highway, the fog thickening with every mile. The trees became indistinct shapes, looming specters in the darkness, and I felt a growing sense of isolation as the world outside faded into an abyss of swirling gray mist. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a flicker of movement in the fog that made my heart drop into my stomach. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure that defied explanation. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I skidded to a stop just inches away. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the windshield, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white dress that fluttered in the breeze, her long hair hanging in tangled strands that framed a face both ethereal and terrifying. But her eyes were what truly haunted me, hollow and devoid of life, like black pits that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. She didn't respond with words, but instead began walking toward me with slow, deliberate movements that seemed unnatural, as if she were floating rather than walking. I felt an overwhelming urge to drive away, to escape this strange encounter, but my body felt frozen in place, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and fascination. Then she raised her hand, pointing directly at me with a finger that seemed too long, too pale. I hit the gas and peeled away, my heart racing as I tried to shake off the encounter. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, but she had vanished completely, swallowed by the fog as if she had never existed at all. The voice on the CB echoed in my mind as I kept driving. Something was watching me. I needed to clear my head, so I flipped on the radio, trying to drown out my thoughts with music, but only static filled the air no matter which station I tried. Then the CB came alive again, the voice more urgent than before, filled with panic that made my blood run cold. "Long Haul 24, are you there? I think it's coming for me. Get off the highway," he shouted before the transmission cut out suddenly, leaving me alone in my cab with an eerie silence pressing in on all sides. Whatever was out there felt closer now, and I drove on, with eyes scanning the road constantly, the trees blurring past me in the fog like ghostly sentinels watching my every move. The fear was palpable, wrapping around me like the thick mist itself. I desperately wanted to find a safe place to stop, but the more I drove, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The shadows seemed to dance just beyond my headlights, and the air felt charged with an electric, unseen presence that made every hair on my body stand on end. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught another glimpse of the woman. She was back, standing by the side of the road with her long hair cascading down her shoulders like a dark veil. I blinked hard, and she was gone again, leaving me to wonder if she was just a figment of my imagination or something far more sinister lurking in the fog. As dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the sky in soft pastels, the fog began to lift like a curtain being drawn back. I found myself at a truck stop, my hands still trembling as I parked and stepped outside. Other drivers were there, and when I told them about the woman in the fog, they exchanged knowing glances. "You're not the first to see her," one old-timer said quietly. "She's been wandering these roads for years, they say. Some folks believe she's searching for something she lost long ago and won't rest until she finds it. I never learned what she was searching for, but I know she's still out there, waiting in the fog for the next traveler to cross her path on those lonely mountain roads." Story 12. The Hitchhiker's Secret. My name is Jake Miller, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, traveling the highways of America and meeting all sorts of interesting characters along the way. I've seen strange sights and encountered unusual people, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one chilly October evening in the heart of Texas, where the roads stretch endlessly under star-filled skies. I was driving a full load of electronics from Los Angeles to Dallas, the highway lonely and illuminated only by my truck's headlights and the occasional flickering of stars overhead. The familiar rhythm of the engine and the steady thumping of tires on asphalt had a lulling effect, making it increasingly difficult to keep my eyes open as fatigue settled in like a heavy blanket. When I noticed a rest area a few miles ahead, I decided to pull over for a quick break. Rolling into the rest area, I was surprised to find it nearly deserted, with only one other truck parked under flickering fluorescent lights, its cab dark and seemingly abandoned. The air was crisp with a hint of approaching rain, and the quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of electrical lines overhead. After visiting the restroom and splashing cold water on my face, I walked back toward my truck, feeling somewhat refreshed. That's when I noticed a figure standing by the other rig, a woman dressed in a long, tattered coat with hair hanging down in messy waves that obscured most of her face. Something about her presence made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she might need assistance. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to sound friendly despite the unease creeping through me. "Are you okay?" She turned slowly to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were wide and vacant, almost as if she were in some kind of trance, staring through me rather than at me. "I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the night sounds. "I can't remember where I am or how I got here." I took a step closer, though something in her demeanor made me want to maintain my distance. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, glancing around to see if anyone else was nearby who might be able to help. "I don't know," she replied, her gaze drifting off into the darkness beyond the rest area. "I can't remember anything clearly. My friends and I were driving, but I think I got separated from them somehow. I think they might be in trouble." Her voice carried a tremor of fear that seemed genuine, and despite my reservations, I felt compelled to offer assistance. "Maybe you should wait here while I call for help," I suggested, though something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation. The way she spoke, the fear in her eyes, it felt like a scene from a horror movie rather than a real encounter on a Texas highway. "No!" she exclaimed suddenly, her eyes flaring with an intensity that startled me. "You don't understand what's happening here. I need to go back before he comes for me. He's always coming for me, and I can't let him find me again." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as her words registered. "Who's coming for you?" I asked, my heart beginning to race with growing alarm, but she just shook her head frantically, her expression shifting to one of deep, primal fear that seemed to emanate from her very core. Before I could respond or ask any more questions, she turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing into the trees that surrounded the rest area like she had never been there at all. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing with questions about what I had just witnessed. Should I have followed her into the woods? Should I call the police? But a deeper instinct urged me to stay away, warning me that getting involved might lead to consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Shaking off the unease, I climbed back into my truck and decided to get some rest. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly and wash away the strange encounter. But just as I was drifting off, my CB radio crackled to life, jolting me upright with my heart racing. "Breaker 19, anyone out there?" The voice was gruff and filled with static that made it difficult to understand clearly. "Long Haul 37, what's your location?" I replied, rubbing my eyes and trying to focus on the conversation. "Just passing through the old rest area off Highway 287. Anyone else around?" the voice asked, sounding increasingly tense with each word. "Yeah, I just pulled in," I responded. "It's pretty quiet though, just me and one other truck here." There was a long pause on the other end before the voice came back, filled with urgency that made my blood run cold. "You see a woman out there? Long coat, messy hair, looks like she's been through hell." My stomach dropped as I realized he was describing exactly what I had witnessed. "Yeah, I saw her," I admitted reluctantly. "She seemed lost, said she was separated from her friends." The response came immediately, filled with warning that chilled me to the bone. "Get out of there right now," the voice urged, with genuine panic. "I've heard stories about that place, about that woman. They say she's not just a lost traveler. Something terrible happened to her there years ago, and now she lures drivers into the woods. People go in to help her, but they never come back out." As I listened to his words, I felt a wave of fear wash over me like ice water. I had been so close to following her, so close to becoming another story that truckers would tell in hushed voices over CB radios. "What exactly happened to her?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Nobody knows for certain, but folks say she was murdered in those woods decades ago. Now her spirit can't rest, and she's searching for someone to take her place, so she can finally move on to whatever comes next. The woods around that rest area are filled with the remains of drivers who tried to help her over the years." I didn't need to hear any more. I fired up the engine and pulled out of the lot immediately, the tires crunching on gravel as I drove away as quickly as possible. In my rearview mirror, I could see the woman standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave with those vacant, haunting eyes that would stay with me for years to come. Story 13. The Highway Spirit. I've been a truck driver for over a decade, traversing America's highways like they were arteries of a living organism, carrying goods and stories from coast to coast. I've seen beautiful sunrises over endless plains, magnificent sunsets painting desert skies, and weather that can shift from blazing heat to bone-chilling cold in mere hours. But nothing could have prepared me for the night that changed everything. The night I encountered something that exists in the space between our world and whatever lies beyond. It was late September and I was traveling my usual route along Highway 66, that legendary stretch of road known for its desolate beauty and, according to some, its ghostly inhabitants who refuse to move on from this world. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple hues that stretched across the horizon like an artist's masterpiece, and I felt the familiar thrill of excitement that comes from having the open road stretching endlessly ahead. My truck, an old Freightliner with over 300,000 miles on its odometer, hummed steadily beneath me as familiar country melodies played softly on the radio. As twilight descended and painted the landscape in shades of blue and gray, I pulled into a small rest area, the kind that often feels like a portal to nowhere, isolated and forgotten by the world that rushes past on the interstate. I needed to stretch my legs and grab a quick bite from the cooler in my cab, so I stepped out into the evening air. Immediately, I noticed an eerie stillness that blanketed the entire area like a heavy quilt. The air was thick with an inexplicable tension, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something significant about to unfold. The rest area was completely empty except for a few scattered picnic tables and a faded sign warning travelers to remain vigilant and aware of their surroundings. I tried to shrug off the unease that was creeping up my spine like cold fingers, walking over to a weathered picnic table where I pulled out a sandwich and thermos of coffee, savoring the peaceful silence as I took a few bites and listened to the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Suddenly, I heard a distant sound that made me pause mid-bite, a faint melody, almost like a lullaby being carried on the wind from somewhere far away. I glanced around carefully, but the rest area remained completely deserted, with only shadows growing longer as the last light of day faded away. Curiosity getting the better of me, I stood up and walked toward the sound, which seemed to be emanating from the tree line that bordered the rest area like a dark curtain. As I approached the edge of the woods, the melody began to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Probably just the wind playing tricks, I muttered to myself, shaking my head at my own nervousness. But as I turned back toward my truck, a sudden chill made me stop dead in my tracks, and I glanced back toward the trees with growing apprehension. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving among the branches, quick as lightning, just a flicker, but enough to send my heart racing like a thoroughbred. "Get a grip," I scolded myself firmly. But as I climbed back into my cab, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The night grew progressively darker as I started the engine and pulled back onto Highway 66, my headlights cutting through the blackness like twin beams of hope. The familiar hum of the truck filled the cab, but that unsettling feeling continued to linger in my mind like smoke that refuses to clear. The melody I had heard still echoed in my thoughts, and I found myself unable to dismiss the sensation that something was fundamentally wrong with this stretch of road. Driving deeper into the night, I kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind me in the darkness. The landscape seemed to change subtly as I traveled, with trees beginning to thin out, and the highway stretching endlessly before me like a ribbon of asphalt leading into infinity itself. It was around midnight when I spotted a flicker of light ahead, and as I drew closer, I realized it was another truck parked on the shoulder. Curiosity overcoming caution, I slowed down and pulled up beside it. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and haunted expression, sat slumped over his steering wheel as if lost in deep, troubled thought. I honked my horn gently, startling him out of his reverie. He looked up with wide, fearful eyes that spoke of recent terror. "You okay, buddy?" I asked through my open window, genuine concern in my voice. He nodded slowly, but I could see that something was definitely wrong. "Just needed a break," he said, his voice shaky and uncertain. "You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but There's something out here on this road that defies explanation." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my growing sense of caution and unease. "There's a ghost," he whispered, glancing nervously around as if afraid the spirit might be listening to our conversation. "I saw her when I was parked here earlier. A woman, pale as fresh snow, just standing in the middle of the road like she belonged there. I thought I was seeing things, hallucinating from too much coffee and not enough sleep. But then she just vanished into thin air." I chuckled nervously, trying to dismiss his words, even as a chill ran down my spine. "You sure it wasn't just fatigue playing tricks on your mind? It happens to all of us out here." He shook his head vehemently, his eyes wide with conviction. "I'm telling you, friend, I'm not the first driver to see her on this stretch of Highway 66. She's been haunting this road for years, they say. Legend has it she was a truck driver herself, who died in a terrible accident, and now her spirit searches endlessly for her lost soul, unable to find peace in death." A chill ran down my spine despite my attempts to remain skeptical. "I've been driving this route for years and never heard about any ghost," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Just be careful, okay?" he said, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "If you see her, don't stop. Just keep driving and don't look back, no matter what you might hear or think you see." With that ominous warning echoing in my mind, I shifted into gear and pulled away, glancing one last time in my rearview mirror to see him still watching me with that haunted expression etched permanently on his weathered face. Story 14. The Dark Passenger. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and if there's one thing I've learned during my countless journeys across America's vast highway system, it's that the open road can hide more than just potholes and wandering deer. Sometimes it conceals dark secrets that are better left undiscovered, and occasionally it brings you face to face with passengers you never intended to pick up. My story takes place on a particularly warm summer night along Interstate 10, a route I've traveled countless times without incident, stretching across Texas like a concrete river carrying commerce and dreams from Houston to Los Angeles. It was an uneventful drive by all accounts, or so I thought as I settled in for the long haul with a load of electronics secured safely in my trailer. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, feeling the familiar weight of fatigue settling over me like a heavy blanket, I decided to stop at a rest area near a small town whose name I can't even remember now. I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, noting how the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows across the cracked asphalt that seemed to move with a life of their own. As I stepped out of my rig and stretched my legs, breathing in the thick night air that carried the mingled scents of diesel fuel and blooming wildflowers, I noticed a woman standing near the edge of the lot. She appeared disheveled and wore a faded dress that fluttered gently in the warm breeze, her hair hanging down in messy waves that obscured most of her face from view. Something about her presence made my skin crawl with an inexplicable unease, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might genuinely need help. The isolation of the rest area, combined with the late hour, made her situation seem potentially dangerous for a woman alone. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound as friendly and non-threatening as possible. "Are you okay? Do you need any assistance?" She turned slowly to face me, and I felt an immediate chill run down my spine like ice water. Her eyes were wide and glassy, almost as if she were in some kind of trance or under the influence of something powerful. "I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of insects chirping in the darkness. "I don't know where I am or how I got here. Everything seems so confused and unclear." I took a tentative step closer, though something deep in my gut urged me to maintain a safe distance. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" I offered, glancing around the empty rest area to see if anyone else might be nearby who could help. "It's pretty late to be out here alone, especially for a woman in your condition." She nodded gratefully, looking relieved that someone had finally stopped to help her. Yes, please, my friends and I were driving together, but somehow I got separated from them. I think they might be in serious trouble, and I need to find them as quickly as possible. Despite my growing reservations about the situation, I couldn't just abandon her there in the middle of nowhere. All right, get in, I said, gesturing toward my truck. I'll help you find your friends and get you somewhere safe where you can call for proper help. As she climbed into the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. Her presence felt heavy and oppressive, as if the air had suddenly thickened around us, making it difficult to breathe normally. I tried to brush off these concerns, focusing instead on getting back on the road and helping this woman in distress. Where were you and your friends headed? I asked as I merged back onto the interstate, trying to make conversation and gather information that might help locate her companions. Just down the road, she said, staring out the window into the impenetrable darkness that surrounded us. We were on our way to California for a music festival. I don't understand how I got separated from them or why I can't remember what happened. The highway stretched before us, empty except for the occasional vehicle zooming past in the opposite direction. Every few minutes I glanced at her, and each time she seemed more distant and ethereal, as if she were slowly fading away before my eyes, like morning mist touched by sunlight. After driving for about 20 minutes through the Texas countryside, I suddenly saw something that made me slam on the brakes so hard that the truck skidded slightly on the asphalt. There, illuminated in my headlights, was another figure standing on the side of the road. Did you see that? I asked, my heart pounding with sudden adrenaline as I struggled to process what I had witnessed. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide with what appeared to be recognition and fear. I think that might be one of my friends, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and terror that I couldn't quite understand. I rolled down my window and called out into the darkness. Hello? Do you need help? The figure moved closer to my truck, stepping into the bright circle of my headlights, and my stomach dropped as I got a clear look at what stood before us. It was another woman, similarly disheveled with wild, unkempt hair and a frantic, desperate look in her eyes that spoke of recent trauma. Please help me, she cried, her voice shaking with emotion. I can't find my sister anywhere, and I'm terrified something terrible has happened to her. What's going on here? I asked, my voice rising with alarm as the situation became increasingly surreal and frightening. They're in trouble, the second woman yelled, pointing frantically toward the dense woods that lined the highway. You have to help us find them before it's too late. They're lost in there somewhere, and I can hear them calling for help. Before I could respond or ask any more questions, the woman who had been riding in my truck suddenly opened the passenger door and climbed out, joining the other woman on the roadside. Wait, come back, I shouted, panic surging through me as I realized I was losing control of the situation entirely. But they were already running toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness between the trees like spirits returning to their natural realm. I sat frozen in my truck for several long moments, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened and decide what I should do next. The smart thing would have been to drive away immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever strange situation I had stumbled into. But something compelled me to investigate further, perhaps the same compassionate instinct that had led me to help the first woman in the first place. Story 15, The Rest Stop Encounter. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, and during that time, I've learned that the road can be both your greatest friend and your most terrifying enemy. I've driven through blizzards that could blind a man, desert heat that could melt steel, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own headlights. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what happened one cold October evening at an abandoned rest stop that most drivers had forgotten even existed. The day had started normally enough, picking up a load of fresh produce from a warehouse outside Sacramento, bound for a grocery distribution center in Chicago. The route was familiar, one I'd driven dozens of times before, winding through the mountains and across the desert plains of Nevada and Utah. The weather was crisp and clear, perfect for making good time and enjoying the spectacular views that never got old, no matter how many times I'd seen them. As evening approached and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I found myself on a particularly isolated stretch of highway, known among truckers for its eerie atmosphere and strange occurrences. Most drivers preferred to push through this section without stopping, but fatigue was beginning to take its toll, and I knew I needed to rest before continuing. That's when I spotted it. An old rest stop that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years, maybe even decades. The paint was peeling from the wooden structures, weeds had grown up through cracks in the asphalt, and several of the light poles were dark, their bulbs long since burned out and never replaced. Everything about the place screamed abandonment and neglect, yet something compelled me to pull in anyway. I parked my rig near what used to be the main building and stepped out into the chilly evening air. The silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the rustle of leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. I stretched my legs and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me like a cold fog. The main building looked like it had once housed restrooms and perhaps a small visitor center, but now it stood as a hollow shell of its former self. Broken glass littered the ground near the entrances, and graffiti covered what remained of the walls, evidence of other travelers who had stopped here over the years, leaving their marks like modern cave paintings. As I approached the building, curiosity overcoming my better judgment, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. I pushed it open and stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. The air was stale and musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. Debris covered the floor, and what remained of the fixtures hung at odd angles, like broken teeth in a skull. I was about to leave when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft sobbing sound echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. My first instinct was to call out to see if someone needed help, but something held me back. The sound was wrong somehow, too hollow, too mournful to be entirely human. "Hello?" I finally called out, my voice echoing off the broken walls. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The sobbing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums like physical weight. Then I saw her, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, partially hidden in shadow. She was a woman dressed in what appeared to be a tattered white dress that hung in shreds around her thin frame. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging down to obscure her face like a dark curtain. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward, while keeping my phone's light trained on her. As she didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I had spoken. She just stood there, swaying slightly as if moved by some unfelt breeze. As I moved closer, I could see that her dress was stained with what looked like old blood, dark patches that had long since dried to the color of rust. Her feet were bare and appeared to be cut and bleeding, as if she had been walking across broken glass for miles. But it was when she finally looked up that I felt my heart nearly stop beating. That the face was the face of a boy. Her face was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of her eyes, like looking into twin pools of ink. When she smiled, I could see that several of her teeth were missing, and those that remained were stained dark with what I hoped was just old blood, but feared might be something worse. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice carrying a strange echo as if it were coming from very far away or from the bottom of a deep well. "This place is not for the living. This place is for those who have nowhere else to go." I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't seem to make my legs move fast enough. I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here. I'll just be going now, and I won't bother you anymore." She laughed then, a sound like wind chimes made of bone being stirred by a hurricane. "Oh, but you can't leave now. You've seen too much, and you know too much. The others will be so happy to have someone new to talk to. It gets lonely here, so very lonely, and we don't get many visitors anymore." As she spoke, I became aware of other sounds in the building, whispers coming from the walls themselves, soft footsteps on floors that creaked despite being empty, and what sounded like multiple voices having conversations in rooms that I knew were vacant. The temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and I could see my breath forming white clouds in the beam of my flashlight. "What others?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She gestured around the building with one pale skeletal hand. "All the travelers who stopped here over the years. All the drivers who thought they could just rest for a few minutes and then continue on their way. They're all still here, you know. They're all still waiting for the road to call them back, but the road doesn't want them anymore. The road has forgotten them, just like everyone else." Story 16, The Phantom Highway. I've spent over a decade driving trucks across America, but one night stands out in my memory like a scar that never quite heals properly. It was a cold evening in November, and I was approaching the final leg of a long haul from Texas to California. The sun had disappeared hours ago, leaving only an endless black ribbon of highway stretched out before me, illuminated by my headlights and the countless stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. The isolation weighed heavily on me as I drove through the emptiness. My radio was tuned to a country station, but static made it difficult to focus on the music, so mostly I listened to the steady hum of my engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, 2:47 in the morning, and felt the familiar sensation of existing in a world where time had slowed to a crawl. I was traveling through a stretch of road that drivers called the Phantom Highway, notorious among truckers for strange sightings and unexplained accidents. Seasoned drivers shared stories of lost souls wandering the roadside at night, and while I had never been one to believe in ghost stories, something about this particular stretch always made me feel uneasy, as if the very air was charged with otherworldly energy. Just as I was approaching the infamous mile marker that every trucker knew by heart, I noticed something unusual on the side of the road, a small, flickering light that danced in the darkness like a firefly that had lost its way. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowed down to investigate, pulling onto the shoulder with my hazard lights blinking. As I got closer, I could see that the light was actually a small campfire, and next to it stood a woman dressed entirely in white. Her clothing seemed to glow in the firelight, creating an almost ethereal appearance that made her look like she had stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. I rolled down my window and called out to her. "Hey there, are you all right?" I asked, keeping my engine running and my foot near the gas pedal, though I couldn't quite explain why I felt the need to be ready for a quick escape. The woman looked up at me, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were wide with an expression that seemed to combine fear and desperation in equal measure. "Please, help me," she said, her voice trembling like leaves in an autumn wind. "I need a ride. Something terrible has happened, and I can't stay here any longer." Something in her tone sent shivers down my spine, but the part of me that had always tried to help people in need wouldn't let me simply drive away. "Where are you headed?" I asked, studying her face for any signs that might explain her distress. "Just up the road," she replied, pointing into the darkness beyond my headlights. "There's a place where I used to feel safe, but I got lost somehow. My friends, they left me behind when things went wrong, and now I don't know how to get back to where I belong." Against every instinct that was screaming at me to leave immediately, I unlocked the passenger door. "All right, get in. It's not safe for anyone to be out here alone at this hour, especially not a woman. As she climbed into the truck, I noticed that her skin felt unusually cold when she brushed against my arm, almost as if she had been standing in freezing temperatures despite the mild desert night. We drove in relative silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the rumble of the engine and the soft whisper of wind through the slightly open windows. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, noticing how she seemed to be lost in thought, staring blankly ahead with an expression that suggested she was seeing something far beyond the road in front of us. "How long have you been out here?" I finally asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled between us like a thick fog. "Not sure," she replied softly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the truck. "Time seems different now, like it moves in circles instead of straight lines. Sometimes I feel like I've been walking along this road forever, and other times it seems like I just arrived moments ago." Her words sent another chill through me, but I pressed on with my questions, hoping to understand her situation better. "What happened to your friends? Why did they leave you behind?" She turned to look at me then, and I was struck by how her eyes seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in an unusual way, almost like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. "They couldn't see me anymore," she said, with a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. "After the accident, everything changed. I tried to call out to them, tried to make them understand that I was still there, but they acted like I had simply vanished into thin air." "What accident?" I asked, though part of me was beginning to suspect that I didn't want to hear the answer. "The one that brought me here," she whispered, her voice becoming even quieter. "The one that made it impossible for me to leave this stretch of highway, no matter how hard I try or how far I walk. I've been searching for a way home ever since, but the road just keeps bringing me back to the same place, over and over again." As she spoke, I became aware that the temperature inside the cab was dropping steadily, despite the heater running at full capacity. My breath was beginning to form small clouds, and I could see frost starting to form on the inside of the windows. The radio, which had been playing soft static, suddenly went completely silent. "Where exactly am I taking you?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly as fear began to override my desire to help. "To the place where it all ended," she said, pointing ahead to where my headlights were beginning to illuminate what looked like the twisted remains of a vehicle on the side of the road. "To the place where I learned that some journeys never really end. They just continue in ways we never expected." As we approached the wreckage, I could see that it was the burned-out shell of what had once been a car, now little more than a skeleton of rusted metal and melted plastic. The sight of it filled me with a dread so profound that I felt like I might be sick. I stopped the truck and turned to look at my passenger, but the seat beside me was empty. And the woman was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. The only evidence of her presence was the lingering smell of smoke and the frost that still covered the windows despite the desert heat that had returned to the cab. I sat there for several minutes, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside and examine the wreckage more closely, I found a small memorial plaque that someone had placed near the twisted metal. It bore the name of a young woman who had died in a car accident on this very spot 3 years earlier, along with a photograph that showed the same face I had just spent 20 minutes talking to. I drove away from that place as quickly as my truck would carry me, but the memory of that night has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, when I'm driving through lonely stretches of highway in the small hours of the morning, I find myself looking for campfires by the side of the road, half expecting to see her standing there again, still searching for a way home that will always remain just beyond her reach. Story 17, The Woods Beyond the Highway. Been a truck driver for nearly 15 years, and in that time I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous encounters happen not on the highway itself, but in the places where civilization ends and something older and more primitive begins. This story takes place on a route through the deep woods of northern Maine, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates even during the brightest days of summer. It was late autumn, and I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill near Bangor to a construction site outside Boston. The route was familiar enough, though I had always found this particular stretch of highway somewhat unsettling. The forest pressed in close on both sides, creating a green tunnel that seemed to swallow sound and light alike, leaving travelers feeling isolated and vulnerable despite being on a major thoroughfare. The sun was setting earlier now that we were deep into October, and by 6 o'clock the woods were already cloaked in premature twilight. I had been driving for 8 hours and was beginning to feel the familiar weight of fatigue settling over me like a heavy blanket. My eyes were getting dry and scratchy, and I found myself blinking more frequently to keep them focused on the road ahead. When I spotted a rest area sign promising facilities just 2 miles ahead, I decided it was time to take a break. The rest area, when I reached it, was smaller than most, just a gravel parking lot carved out of the forest with a single building that housed restrooms and vending machines. A few picnic tables were scattered around the perimeter, though they looked like they hadn't been used in years. I pulled my rig into the lot and climbed out, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of sitting. The air was crisp and carried the rich scent of decomposing leaves and pine needles. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of running water, probably a stream that wound through the forest beyond the rest area boundaries. After using the facilities and grabbing a cup of coffee from one of the vending machines, I decided to take a short walk around the perimeter of the rest area to get my blood flowing again. The walking path was well maintained and led toward the sound of running water I had heard earlier. Signs along the path warned visitors to stay on the marked trail and not to venture into the woods alone, especially after dark. I followed the path for about a quarter mile until I reached a small wooden bridge that crossed a babbling brook. The water was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones that had been polished by countless years of erosion. I stood on the bridge for a few minutes, enjoying the peaceful sound of moving water and the way the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy above. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this peaceful setting. It was a voice, faint but clearly human, calling out from somewhere deeper in the woods. The voice sounded distressed, almost panicked, and seemed to be calling for help. My first instinct was to respond, to call back and see if someone was in trouble. But something held me back. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could make out words. "Help me, please. I'm lost." It was a woman's voice, young and frightened, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where it was coming from. Every instinct I had told me that someone was in genuine distress and needed assistance, but another part of my mind whispered warnings about leaving the safety of the marked trail. I called back, "Where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you." My voice seemed to be absorbed by the forest, swallowed up by the thick vegetation before it could travel very far. The response came immediately, but from a different direction than the previous calls. "Over here, by the big oak tree. I hurt my ankle and I can't walk." The voice was definitely closer now, and seemed to be coming from a thick grove of trees about 50 yards off the main path. I could see what might have been the oak tree she was referring to, a massive specimen that towered above the surrounding forest. Against my better judgment, I left the path and began making my way through the underbrush toward the sound of the voice. The going was difficult, with thick brambles that caught at my clothes, and hidden roots that threatened to trip me with every step. The deeper I went into the woods, the darker it became, as the canopy above grew thicker and blocked out what little daylight remained. I had been walking for about 10 minutes when I realized that I could no longer hear the woman's voice. I stopped and called out again. "Hello, are you still there? I'm coming to help you." But the forest had fallen completely silent. Even the sound of the stream had faded to nothing, and I couldn't hear any of the normal forest sounds. No birds, No insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Looking around, I realized that I was no longer entirely sure which direction I had come from. The trees all looked the same in the growing darkness, and the underbrush was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. Panic began to creep in as I understood that I might be lost myself. I pulled out my cell phone to use its flashlight, but the screen showed no signal bars at all. Even worse, the battery indicator showed that the phone was nearly dead, despite having been fully charged when I left that morning. The flashlight beam seemed weak and ineffective, barely penetrating the darkness that surrounded me on all sides. That's when I heard the voice again, but this time it sounded different. Less human somehow, with an echoing quality that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "Thank you for coming," it said, and I realized that the words seemed to be coming from directly above me, as if someone were speaking from the treetops. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice. There, perched on a thick branch about 20 feet above my head, was a figure that might once have been human, but was now something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and bent at angles that should have been impossible. Its skin was pale and seemed to glow with a sickly phosphorescence that provided the only real light in the dark forest. "You shouldn't have left the path," the thing said, in a voice that was definitely not the same one that had been calling for help. "The path is safe, but here in the deep woods, different rules apply. Here, we decide who stays and who gets to leave." I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without any regard for the noise I was making or the direction I was heading. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't dare stop or slow down. Behind me I could hear sounds of pursuit, not footsteps exactly, but a rustling and crackling that suggested something large was moving through the trees, following my path. Story 18. The Empty Highway. I've been driving trucks for most of my adult life, and I've always found comfort in the rhythm of the road. The steady hum of the engine, the gentle vibration of tires on asphalt, and the endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon. But there's one night that stands out from all the others. A night when the familiar comfort of the road transformed into something altogether more sinister and threatening. It was the middle of winter, and I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a route that would take me through some of the most desolate stretches of highway in the country. The weather had been cooperating for most of the trip, with clear skies and good visibility, but as I entered a particularly remote section of Interstate 40 in New Mexico, things began to change in ways that still make me question my sanity. The sun had set hours earlier, and I was driving through a landscape that seemed utterly devoid of human presence. No towns, no houses, no other vehicles, just endless miles of desert on both sides of the highway, illuminated only by my headlights and the pale glow of a half moon overhead. The radio had been losing station steadily as I drove deeper into the wilderness, and now there was nothing but static on every frequency. Around midnight, I began to notice something strange about the road itself. The familiar landmarks that I used to gauge my progress, mile markers, exit signs, overpasses, seemed to be repeating in patterns that didn't make sense. I passed the same rock formation 3 times in what should have been 30 miles of straight highway. The same billboards appeared and reappeared with unsettling regularity. At first, I attributed this to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of long-distance driving. It wasn't uncommon for tired drivers to experience mild hallucinations or confusion, especially on monotonous stretches of highway. I pulled over at what appeared to be a rest area, though I couldn't remember seeing it on any map, and stepped out to clear my head with some fresh air. The rest area was strangely pristine, as if it had been built recently but never used. The facilities were clean and well maintained, the vending machines were fully stocked and operational, but there were no signs that anyone else had ever stopped there. No litter, no wear patterns on the pavement, no graffiti or other evidence of human presence. I used the restroom and bought a cup of coffee from one of the machines, hoping the caffeine would help me stay alert for the remaining hours of my drive. But when I returned to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The odometer, which had shown over 200,000 miles when I parked, now read exactly 0. The trip meter, the engine hours, even the radio precedes, everything had been reset as if the truck had just rolled off the assembly line. Telling myself that it must be some kind of electrical malfunction, I climbed back into the cab and continued driving. But as the miles passed, I began to realize that something fundamental had changed about my situation. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, with no variation in scenery and no signs of approaching dawn, despite the fact that I had been driving all night. My fuel gauge, which should have been approaching empty by this point, remained stubbornly at 3/4 full. The clock on my dashboard seemed to be moving normally, but when I checked my watch, the hands hadn't moved at all. The stars overhead maintained the same positions they had held when I first noticed them hours earlier, as if time itself had become frozen in this desolate place. I tried using my CB radio to contact other drivers, but heard only empty static on every channel. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area, but it also showed a battery level that never seemed to change no matter how long I used it. Everything about my situation suggested that I had somehow slipped out of the normal flow of time and space. The road signs, when they appeared, showed destinations that I had never heard of, towns with names like Nowhere Springs, Population Zero Junction, and Last Chance Crossing. The exit numbers increased normally for a while, then began counting backward, then jumped to seemingly random 3-digit combinations that made no mathematical sense. As I continued driving through this impossible landscape, I began to see other vehicles on the road. Trucks, cars, and motorcycles that appeared briefly in my headlights before vanishing into the darkness ahead or behind me. When I tried to catch up with them or flag them down, they would disappear as if they had never been there at all. The other drivers, when I could see them clearly enough, all had the same expression of confusion and fear that I was beginning to feel myself. They were trapped just as I was, caught in some kind of temporal loop or dimensional pocket that existed alongside the normal highway system but operated according to different rules entirely. I don't know how long I drove through that nightmare landscape. Hours, days, weeks, it was impossible to tell. The fuel gauge never moved, the sun never rose, and the endless highway continued to stretch ahead without any sign of leading anywhere. I began to wonder if this was what death was like. An eternal journey with no destination, trapped forever in the cab of a truck that would never need fuel or maintenance. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strangeness ended. I crested a small hill and saw the lights of a truck stop in the distance. Real lights connected to real buildings with real people inside. The radio crackled back to life with a late-night talk show. The stars resumed their normal movement across the sky, and my fuel gauge dropped to where it should have been all along. I pulled into that truck stop and sat in the parking lot for an hour, just watching normal people go about their normal business. Truckers checking their loads, travelers buying snacks and coffee, families with children using the restrooms. Everything was exactly as it should be, as if the hours I had spent on that impossible highway had never happened at all. When I finally worked up the courage to check my logbook and GPS, I discovered that I had somehow covered the exact distance I should have during the missing time, arriving precisely when my schedule indicated I would. But I knew that I had experienced something beyond normal reality, something that existed in the spaces between the mapped and measured world. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that stretch of highway, but I know that somewhere out there, parallel to our normal roads, there are other highways where different rules apply, and where travelers can become lost in ways that have nothing to do with wrong turns or missed exits. Story 19, The Midnight Caller. I've been hauling freight across America for the better part of 2 decades, and I thought I had encountered every possible situation the road could throw at me. I've driven through blizzards that turned highways into skating rinks, thunderstorms that split the sky with lightning, and heat waves that made the asphalt shimmer like water. But nothing in all those years prepared me for the night when my CB radio became a conduit for something that shouldn't have been able to reach across the divide between the living and the dead. It was a humid summer evening in August, and I was driving a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Little Rock, following Interstate 35 through the heart of Missouri. The traffic was light, as it usually is during the late evening hours, with only the occasional car or fellow trucker sharing the highway with me as the miles rolled steadily beneath my wheels. Around 11 o'clock, as I was passing through a particularly rural stretch of highway bordered by cornfields that stretched to the horizon on both sides, my CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the usual chatter between drivers about traffic conditions or weather reports, but something far more personal and desperate. "Breaker 19, this is Lost Soul looking for help," the voice said, and something about its tone made my skin crawl with unease. "I've been trying to reach someone, anyone, for what feels like forever. Can anybody hear me out there?" I picked up the microphone and responded, "This is Eastbound Eddie. I can hear you loud and clear. What's your situation, driver? Are you broken down somewhere and need assistance?" There was a long pause before the voice came back, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo from somewhere deep and dark. "I don't think I'm broken down exactly, but I can't seem to find my way back to where I'm supposed to be. I've been driving for so long that I've lost track of time completely." Something about the way he spoke sent chills down my spine, but I tried to maintain a helpful attitude. "Where are you trying to get to? Maybe I can help you figure out your location and get you pointed in the right direction." "That's the problem," the voice replied, and I could hear what sounded like genuine confusion and fear. "I can't remember where I was going or where I came from. All I know is that I've been on this road for longer than seems possible, and nothing looks familiar anymore." I glanced at my GPS and checked the mile markers to get a precise fix on my location. "Well, I'm currently at mile marker 67 on Interstate 35 in Missouri, heading south toward Arkansas. Where does your GPS show you to be?" The response that came back made my blood run cold. "I don't have a GPS anymore, and I can't find any mile markers. The road I'm on doesn't seem to have any signs at all, just endless asphalt stretching in both directions. I haven't seen another vehicle in hours, maybe days." I tried to process what he was telling me, but it didn't make sense according to any normal understanding of how the highway system worked. "What's the last thing you remember clearly? When did you last stop for fuel or food?" "I think I stopped at a truck stop somewhere, but when I try to remember the details, everything gets fuzzy and unclear," the voice said, growing more agitated with each word. "I remember talking to someone there, another driver, who warned me about something, but I can't recall what the warning was about." As I listened to his story, I began to feel increasingly uneasy about the entire conversation. Something about his voice, about the way it seemed to fade in and out despite the strong signal strength, reminded me of stories other drivers had told about phantom transmissions from truckers who had died on the road, but somehow continued trying to communicate through their radios. "What's your name, driver?" I asked, hoping to get some concrete information that might help me understand what was happening. "I think it's Mike, but even that doesn't feel certain anymore," he replied. "Everything about who I used to be seems to be slipping away, like water running through my fingers. The only thing that remains clear is this overwhelming need to find my way home." I spent the next hour talking with Mike, trying to help him piece together his memories and figure out his situation. He described driving through landscapes that didn't match any geography I knew, passing through towns with names that didn't appear on any map, and encountering other travelers who seemed just as lost and confused as he was. As we talked, I began to notice that the signal quality was deteriorating, not in the usual way that happened when vehicles moved apart, but in a more fundamental way, as if the transmission was coming from an increasingly great distance. His voice started to sound hollow and echoing, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I can feel myself fading," Mike said during one of our exchanges, and there was a panic in his voice that made my heart race. "It's like I'm being pulled away from this frequency, away from any connection to the world I used to know. Please, if you're still there, don't let me disappear completely." I keyed the microphone and spoke as clearly and forcefully as I could. "I'm still here, Mike. I'm not going anywhere. Just keep talking and stay focused on the sound of my voice. Maybe if you concentrate hard enough, you can find your way back to wherever you belong." But the static was getting worse with each transmission, and his voice was becoming fainter and more distorted. I could barely make out his words as he said, "Thank you for listening, for being there when I needed someone to talk to. I think I can see some lights ahead now, lights that look like they might lead somewhere safe." "That's good, Mike," I replied, though I wasn't sure he could still hear me clearly. "Follow those lights and don't look back. Maybe they'll take you where you need to go." His final transmission was so faint that I had to strain to hear it at all. "I think I can see them now. The people I've been looking for. They're waiting for me just ahead. Thank you for helping me find my way home." After that, there was only silence on the frequency, no matter how many times I called his name or tried to raise him on the radio. I drove through the rest of the night in contemplative silence, thinking about Mike and wondering what had really happened during our conversation. The next morning, when I stopped for breakfast at a truck stop in Arkansas, I overheard two drivers talking about a memorial service they had attended the previous week for a fellow trucker named Mike who had died in an accident on Interstate 35 in Missouri. According to their conversation, he had been found in his cab after jackknifing on a curve during a thunderstorm, apparently trying to reach for his CB radio when the crash occurred. I never told anyone about my conversation with Mike that night, partly because I knew they wouldn't believe me, and partly because I preferred to think of it as a final kindness, giving a lost soul the chance to say goodbye before moving on to whatever comes next. Story 20, the final rest stop. I've been driving trucks for 15 years now, and I've always prided myself on being a practical, no-nonsense kind of guy who doesn't believe in things that can't be explained by logic and common sense. Ghosts, supernatural encounters, unexplained phenomena, all of that was just stories that drivers told to pass the time during long, lonely nights on the road. At least, that's what I believed, until I experienced something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. The incident occurred during what should have been a routine run from Portland to Denver, carrying a load of computer equipment through some of the most beautiful but isolated country in the Pacific Northwest. It was late October, and the autumn colors were spectacular. Brilliant reds and golds painting the mountainsides like nature's own masterpiece, while crystal clear streams wound through valleys that seemed untouched by human civilization. I had been driving for about 6 hours when I decided to stop at a rest area that I had never noticed before, despite having traveled this route dozens of times over the years. It was tucked away in a grove of ancient pine trees, accessible via a narrow access road that curved through the forest before opening into a small clearing with parking spaces and basic facilities. The rest area was completely deserted when I arrived, which wasn't unusual given the remote location and the late hour. What was unusual was how perfectly maintained everything appeared to be. The restrooms were spotlessly clean, the picnic tables looked like they had been installed yesterday, and the landscaping was manicured to a degree that seemed almost artificial in its perfection. I parked my rig and stepped out into the crisp mountain air, breathing deeply and enjoying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of running water, probably a mountain stream flowing down from the peaks that surrounded this hidden valley. After using the facilities and stretching my legs with a short walk around the perimeter of the rest area, I decided to grab a quick meal from the supplies I kept in my cab. I was sitting at one of the picnic tables, enjoying a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, when I first noticed that something was odd about this place. Despite being completely alone, I kept hearing sounds that suggested other people were nearby. Distant conversations that were just too faint to make out clearly, the sound of car doors closing, and what might have been children playing somewhere in the woods. Every time I looked around to locate the source of these sounds, I saw nothing but empty parking spaces and silent forest. As the evening progressed and the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the rest area, the sounds became more distinct and frequent. I could hear what sounded like families having picnics, couples talking quietly on benches, and the general murmur of human activity that you would expect at a popular rest stop during peak hours. But when I looked directly at any spot where the sound seemed to be coming from, there was nothing there but empty space and gathering darkness. It was as if I were hearing echoes of activities that had taken place here at some other time, perhaps years or even decades ago, when this rest area had been busy with travelers making their way through the mountains. Curiosity overcoming my growing unease, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly to see if I could find some explanation for the phantom sounds. I walked along a narrow trail that led from the main rest area deeper into the forest, following the sound of running water that I had heard earlier. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through groves of towering evergreens and across small wooden bridges that spanned crystal-clear streams. As I walked, the sounds of invisible activity continued around me, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling at the same time. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came upon a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a spectacular view of the valley below. In the center of the clearing was a large stone monument that I hadn't noticed from the parking area, partially hidden by the surrounding vegetation. As I approached the monument, I could see that it was some kind of memorial, with names and dates carved into its polished granite surface. Reading the inscriptions more closely, I realized that this was a memorial to travelers who had died in accidents on this stretch of highway over the past several decades. The names ranged from recent dates back to the 1950s, when this highway was first constructed through the mountains. Some of the entries included brief descriptions of the accidents, weather crashes, mechanical failures, and simple human error that had claimed the lives of drivers and passengers who were just trying to get from one place to another safely. As I stood there reading the names and thinking about the lives that had been cut short on these dangerous mountain roads, I began to understand what I had been experiencing. The sounds I was hearing weren't echoes from the past, but somehow the presence of those who had never made it to their final destinations, still trying to complete journeys that death had interrupted. Looking back toward the rest area, I could now see them. Translucent figures moving among the picnic tables and parking spaces, families and individuals who appeared solid enough until you looked directly at them, at which point they would fade to near invisibility. They were going through the motions of normal rest-stop activities, as if this place served as some kind of way station between the world of the living and whatever comes after. A young woman in 1960s clothing was pushing a child on a swing that I couldn't see. An elderly man in a vintage trucker's uniform was checking the engine of a rig that existed only in whatever realm he now inhabited. A family of 4 was having a picnic at a table that appeared empty when I looked directly at it, but seemed occupied in my peripheral vision. None of them seemed threatening or malevolent, just confused and lost, unable to accept that their journeys had ended and that they needed to move on to wherever spirits go when they finally let go of the physical world. They were stuck in a loop, eternally stopping at this rest area that existed in both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. As I watched these ghostly travelers, I felt a deep sadness for their situation, but also a growing understanding that this place served an important purpose. It was a sanctuary for those who had died suddenly and violently, a place where they could come to terms with their new state of existence before moving on to whatever awaited them beyond. I spent another hour at the memorial, reading the names and silently acknowledging each person who had died on these treacherous mountain roads. As I did so, I noticed that some of the ghostly figures began to fade away entirely, as if my recognition of their stories had somehow given them permission to complete their interrupted journeys. When I finally returned to my truck and prepared to continue my own journey, I felt a profound sense of peace about what I had experienced. I had been privileged to witness something that most people never see, proof that death is not an ending but a transition, and that love and compassion can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Driving away from that rest area, I knew that I would never forget what I had seen there, and that my understanding of the world had been forever changed by my encounter with travelers who had never reached their destinations, but had found a different kind of peace in that hidden sanctuary among the mountains.